All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. The topic for this evening is the next 10 to 10,000 years. What can we expect? What do we want? And what should we want? As a point of departure, I suggested readings from Bostrom, Scheffler, and Sidgwick. Bostrom because he's one of the most kind of influential active thinkers on these topics. Sidgwick because he's a great utilitarian thinker, and utilitarianism and the sort of philosophical method that motivates it is one important framework for thinking about these topics. Scheffler because he takes utilitarianism seriously, but he has some notable reservations about the ideas of impartiality and maximization that you find in kind of mainstream utilitarian thought. So the order of business for this evening, we'll start with a round of kind of 1-minute introductions. I'll ask you to say sort of where you're calling in from, what you're working on, and then answer the question, in 500 years' time, what is one thing you hope will be the same, and one thing you hope will be different? Once we're done with that, we'll go into sort of 60 or 90 minutes of open discussion and reflection. And then for the last sort of 30 to 60 minutes, we'll kind of zoom in on the question of what should we actually do about all this? And I hope that we can kind of draw on the hopes that we've shared during the introductions at the start, and then maybe develop some notes towards some kind of vision for the future, and perhaps even some concrete project ideas to sort of match that. One quick matter of logistics before we dive in. I've made a Google Doc for this salon, and I've just posted it into the salon chat. I'd like to suggest that you have this open during the call, and if you want to, you can put notes or share links, or even just have kind of conversations in that document. It's perfectly fine to use the Zoom chat as well if you prefer, but I don't know, I kind of find Google Doc is a little more spacious. So with that, let's go to introductions. As I said, let's try to speak for about a minute each. I'll call out your name and I will unmute you, so you don't have to do anything. Let me just see if I can actually do that. Yep, I can. I'm just going to mute the people who are not muted, because apparently that's important. Yeah, so I'll call out your name, and then it's your job to say just where you are, what you're working on, and then tell us something you hope will be the same in 500 years, and something you hope will be different. And I'm just going to go in the order that is on my list. So that makes let's see. Ashley is the first on my list. Ashley Zhang.
Gosh, it's a lot of pressure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I feel like I'm being like cold. I'm Ashley. I'm from California, but I'm currently in Alaska. I am a university student studying philosophy, politics, and economics, and I help out with the intellect in like part-time. Yeah, I think, what were the questions? One thing you hope will be the same. I guess I hope humans will still remain and flourish on our planet, maybe others, but primarily Earth. And one thing I hope will be different. I hope we expand our empathy for all of humanity and also other organisms. I feel like it's kind of a cliche to say we live in a pretty divisive age, but also I'm optimistic that we can overcome and be more united.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ashley.
Okay.
So next, yeah, that's perfect. That's wonderful. So next up, I've got Christian Gonzalez.
Easy, that's me.
Probably got that wrong.
Yeah, it's nice. Italian. Can you hear me pretty well?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, yeah, excuse the noise in the background. I'm out right now, but anyways, shoot, brief introduction. So I recently graduated, kind of. I double majored in physics and philosophy. So I'm really interested in like fundamental questions, in particular moral theory, which is why I'm here. I think it was about a few months ago I read The Method of Ethics, and I pretty much agreed with Sidgwick in his conclusion of like, there's a fundamental bridge between that kind of impersonal and the personal view, or the agent relative or the agent neutral view. And I don't think that that gap can be bridged, which is why, to answer the question of what I hope is better in 500 years, or what do I hope changes in 500 years, I'd probably say I hope we reverse the trend of atomization, and that we find a way of making rich, holistic communities surround as many people, as many individuals as possible. So I think we're just wired for that. What do I hope stays the same? I would say probably the very human desire to strive for, improvement or greatness, or to venture off into the unknown. I would say I hope that trend continues and really get better at doing it. So that's me.
Nice. Thanks, Christian. So next up, I have Dave Crouch.
Thanks. I'm connecting from Athens, Georgia in the southeastern US. I'm not formally working on anything in this field, but I'm very interested in where it's all going and how we can kind of help it get there, positively. One thing I'd like to stay the same is more that current trends continue toward the improvement of healthcare and food production, at least on a technological level. There are, of course, other issues to that. One thing that I would like to change is I'd like to see humanity come up with a way of limiting violence at all levels, whether it's war, crime, anything like that, without the application of violence. Kind of a tall order, but it'd be nice.
Yeah, tell me about it. Thanks, David. So next up, I have Ethan Edwards.
Hey, I'm Ethan. I'm right now in California, normally based in the New York City area. Until recently, I was working at Bell Labs doing art and technology work, and now I'm kind of exploring different gigs, maybe hopefully somewhat related to the stuff we're going to talk about. And to choose one specific thing I hope stays the same is I hope the Grand Canyon mostly stays the same, albeit with 500 years more of erosion. But I hope one thing that changes is that the people visiting it are different, that there's more of them, and that somehow we make the necessary steps that everyone can go there with a much deeper understanding and appreciation, and really get so that the peak experience that someone might have now is even deeper and more accessible to everyone.
Nice, thanks for that, Ethan. So next up, I have Jiva.
Hi all, I'm Jiva. I'm from Chennai, India. I'm a designer. So when I saw the salon, I was kind of immediately went into a rabbit hole of thinking, for 500 years. I think I kind of felt, 500 years, huge. It's a long time, for a lot to happen, especially with now the technology. It feels like, even 10 years feels like a long time, just a decade, it feels like, I was thinking of 2010, you kind of see, so much happened. It feels like a different era altogether, just the 10 years, with things happening politically and the climate issue and other things. So I kind of want, while thinking about it, whether I can think, positively and, be, whether it's going to be utopian or, dystopian. And I was wondering whether, how things would be, whether we would thrive, or, whether we would with extremism, in politically and also in different countries, how things are kind of trending towards, so that is those are all things kind of in my mind, and so, but I'm still optimistic, we would in 500 years, we would still be thriving, I would say, but I think that would lot will happen in between that time, that would change altogether, how we live, I think. I am someone, I think, the way we believe, way we, the religion or the how we kind of collaborate as a humanity itself will, I think, change. But my concern is whether the change will come because of the the steps we take now, or whether it will because of something catastrophic, and then you have to kind of rebuild, because you didn't make the change now, we as a humanity has failed to make the change, and now you are pushed to rebuild, and yeah. So that is my concern, whether we will do the right thing now, or whether we will only we would do that after we are pushed to do. Yeah.
Okay, can I press you just for something you hope would stay the same? Eva?
Come again?
Can I press you? Can I press you to share with us something concrete that you hope will be the same in 500 years?
Concrete. I think one thing we would still the concrete, I think, would be the connecting of that is this yearning for yearning to connect with other humans. I think that will be the one thing, the very concrete, I think, that you can't take away, despite all the issues we have between us, the one thing I would be, that very concrete, that you would still be there, even if it's few people, who are, let's seeing it if things didn't go optimistically. Still, one thing that would be concrete, that would be the the yearning to connect with another human being. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing. So next we have Mike McCormick.
Hey guys, good to meet you. Let's see. So I am Mike. I live in San Francisco, which is where I am now. So let's see, my day job is being a venture capitalist. I invest in early stage companies, mostly healthcare companies, trying to figure out how to get the United States out of, its horrible healthcare situation and our really screwed up system. I work kind of on the side and spending more and more time in kind of the worlds that intersect effective altruism, long-termism, funding moonshots, getting more people to sort of, expand their spheres of moral concern, both sort of geographically and temporally, and then sort of putting a lot of money and talent behind projects that kind of might have a concrete impact on those results and sort of, the beautification of the future, so to speak. So I do work with a group called Founders Pledge, also do work with a group called Effective Giving, interested in, groups like Long Now and the like. Let's see, one thing I hope is the same in 500 years as that humans exist. Definitely on board with, like Toby Ord and the idea that we're at this very precarious, interesting place where we could totally destroy ourselves, or we could sort of hit a point of thriving in abundance, and it's not necessarily clear which one of those is going to happen. One thing that I hope is different is sort of the level of sort of thriving and flourishing that the average person feels. I mean, I think there's a pretty interesting part in the Bostrom TED Talk it was in the doc that was sort of talking about, you know, it's not just about sort of staying alive, it's about sort of understanding these different qualitative types of living and of experiencing the world that we can do. And I tend to think that the you know, there's just like a ton of room for improvement, or just even exploration of different states of consciousness, different states of emotion, different states of, you know, of thriving and interacting with each other. And so I hope in 500 years we've kind of brought ourselves up that ladder of subjective well-being.
Nice. Thanks, Mike. So I think last on the list, and certainly not least, is Pamela Hobart. It's nice to see you, Pamela.
Hey, Peter. Are you drinking coffee and wine?
Not yet.
Okay.
That would be amazing. And by the way, Peter, can you do yours too after Pamela? Because I don't know if we heard yours.
Yes, of course. No, I'll go last. Yes.
Okay. I'm just Josh and Peter. It's only it's not even 1 p.m. here in Austin, Texas. So it's kind of like, oh, you know, we'll get there maybe later. Yeah, I'm in Austin. My name's Pamela Hobart. I'm a former kind of academic philosopher. I studied ethics and the philosophy of education. And for the past 2 years or so, I've had a philosophical coaching and consulting practice, you know, for people who are trying to bring philosophical ideas to bear on their life in various ways. And so, yeah, I'm in the weird position of being deeply, deeply skeptical about the capacity to make any of these predictions, and really worried about the political ramifications of people doing this, and sort of the factors involved beyond just like, can you make a good prediction or not, that are about control and power. And so a lot of my clients, you know, they're people who I end up encouraging to think actually very small, you know, to focus a little more on your very small life and a little less on the very long term. And I don't know how to create an ecosystem where there are a few of the right people doing the long thing well and in the right way, and everyone else just sort of stays out. That's what I'm here to think about a little more. Anyway, this is not lofty, but I hope that, well, I'm the opposite of Mike here. I don't really get a strong intuition about whether I hope there are people existing that far into the future, but if there are people, I hope they're still eating food, you know, like food that comes in different kinds, and not, maybe part-time, maybe they have like the actually good Soylent the rest of the time, or straight into my veins or whatever. But I feel like eating food is such an important experience, like socioculturally, and has been for a long time, that maybe it's stands a chance of persisting into the future, even as it changes form over and over again. Something that I hope changes, I'm unhappy with how unclear it is how to tell the difference between difficulties in people's lives that help them to improve and learn, and which ones are just pain and waste. And so I would like to imagine that there's some way to change human life so that large chunks of the experiences that are pain and waste and just suffering can be eradicated, but not all of it. You know, not just like we're going to push a button and give you all the right preferences. When I was watching that Bostrom video, he's like, "Oh, the potential for moral development," and I'm like, "What moral? What moral development? Like, you get a body that's good and like, you know, better drugs, like it's something else, you know." So the change is that I'd hope we'd get some refined concept of when hardship is sort of worth it. I don't see any that's viable now.
That's great. Thanks, Pamela. I'm going to meet you again. I'll just confess that got one of these here, and my 3 screens are on top of empty boxes of fuel. So, anyway, okay, so it's me. I should do this as well, I suppose. So yes, I'm Peter, and I'm dialing in from the south of France, but I am British originally. I'm sort of 80% unemployed right now, and I'm kind of focused on independent study. Until recently, I was running the website over at 80,000 Hours, which is a non-profit, which is sort of concerned with a bunch of these themes and tries to help people figure out cool things to work on that might stand some small chance of helping steer things in a good direction. So something I hope will be the same in 500 years. I mean, we had a lot of good answers. I'm going to say, kind of agreeing with several of you, like, I hope there'll be at least some form of intelligent life still on Earth. And the sort of conservative part of this is that I hope at least some of them will be listening to Bach. Yes, and something I hope will be different. Well, I guess it's kind of boring as an answer, but I guess I just hope that the ratio of kind of suffering to pleasure will improve dramatically. Okay, it's philosophically kind of maybe obvious, but it's, in a way, it's, well, it's just so important. And I guess, yeah, sort of in light of what Pamela was saying, I'm kind of on board with and open to the idea that certain kinds of negative experience are kind of instrumentally useful, and we should be cautious about going for a kind of full abolitionist sort of project. But nevertheless, I'm pretty sure that there's a heck of a lot of fairly abject suffering that has no plausible kind of instrumental justification. So yeah, I hope we can do something about that. So that's introductions. I've tried to take notes on kind of what you guys said in the Google Doc. And so, we can hopefully kind of circle back to these sort of hopes, in the last part of the discussion this evening. I think everyone was kind of on the call at the start, but just if you missed it, there's a link to this Google Doc in the Zoom chat, and I suggest you open the doc. So yeah, with that, I guess let's just dive into open discussion. One thing I just want to sort of try is that, sometimes the host ends up taking a bit too much space on calls like this. So I'm going to borrow a technique that I learned from Peter Limberg of the STOA. And that's just that I'm going to mute myself entirely for the first 20 minutes or so, and only, join in the conversation sometime after that. So I'll leave it, the floor is open for somebody to sort of kick things off. Yeah, if you want a sort of topic to start with, I mean, honestly, we could just talk about where to start as we think about these kind of questions. It's kind of, to me, a bit, one could, well, there are lots of great starting points. And I'm curious to sort of hear a bit about where you guys like to start when you're thinking about this. So I'll still be on video, but muted for about at least 20 minutes, and look forward to the discussion.
So can I actually just start with a question? So I think that kind of the various kind of philosophies that we're thinking about, I wouldn't say they take it as like a given that like it's good for humans to sort of continue to survive and exist, but they're sort of grappling with that question, but generally directionally, like saying yes, that is the case, and there's sort of these various reasons why that is good, or at least sort of a prerequisite for good. And Pamela, it sounds like your instincts don't necessarily take you there, and I would just love to hear more about that, and then maybe anybody else's intuitions on that as well.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like academic baggage or something, but I feel sort of just allergic to anything close to a claim about like intrinsic value. And so when I think about the idea that like humans ought to persist, just sort of full stop, it sounds like sort of close to that to me. However, I will say that I wonder, when I'm playing devil's advocate with myself, I can't tell. I mean, okay, so it's like, maybe I'd say something like, it doesn't really matter if humans exist per se, it matters that they exist well, you know, and then there's some filling in of what well means, everyone's above a certain baseline or whatever. And then I wonder, is it just an empirical thing that like you can't do that, having people who are living well without actually accidentally in the process attending to the features that would take us far into the future? You know, like maybe they sort of converge in practice. If that makes sense. Like we might be getting a slice of time where we're sort of living well, but climate change is hanging over our heads, but like it's not gonna last forever. And so then people will suffer on the way out. It's not like you're gonna wake up one day and everyone will just be dead. Like there's gonna be a bunch of terrible stuff. So it might not, they might not be so different in the end.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear anybody else's take. I mean, I guess I have a slightly more like kind of maybe like classic, like utilitarian point of view, that sort of value is primarily sort of in the experience of sentient beings, and therefore to sort of have that value, just a prerequisite for it is like those sentient beings existing. So I think there are like plenty of like not great ways for humans or other sentient beings to exist, and plenty of other like not great states of being. But if you want a shot at it, you have to sort of start with, at the very least, you know, existing. It's sort of a ground level prereq for even having a chance at the good life, or whatever you might call it.
I'm not sure if this is like directly related, but this is like what popped up when I listened to what Pamela said. I feel like I kind of alternate between two states of thinking that like humanity is such a small speck in the grand scheme of the universe, and it's a little like hubristic to think that like, oh, we're so great and deserve to live forever and we should aim for immortality. But I'm also feel like there's this new strain of like a misanthropic trap of like saying that, oh, like humans have destroyed this planet and we're so terrible, and the world will end in 30 years, so might as well just continue on as we are right now. I don't know if there's like a good middle ground. I feel like we're all just striving to find it, but I feel like that should be the aim, where we're sufficiently critical of all the bad things we've done, but also somehow just optimistic, or like, I guess like preserving some like tenets of like humanism, where we believe in like the human capacity to improve, and et cetera, et cetera.
I'll throw this out as a possible middle ground. There may be a meaning to life or to existence that has not been discovered or demonstrated yet. And since humans are the only thing we're aware of in the universe that are capable of experiencing meaning, we could make the argument that humans should be encouraged to stick around to increase the chances that meaning will be found, proven, discovered. That might be enough to keep us going for another couple centuries.
But my question would be, why do we have to find meaning?
I'd say it would be helpful to find meaning because that would give us a baseline. A lot of the pre-Salon reading had to do with utilitarianism, and we all know utilitarianism has its flaws, but it's definitely a good starting point for figuring out what counts as good, what counts as living well. So I think meaning almost has to be part of the discussion if we do want to figure out what are the better and worse ways to move forward. What do you think, though? Can we take a different approach than finding meaning?
I'm just curious, because I'm kind of also on the, I would say like Pamela, it's like I'm someone who feel, it's not like all the human beings, we as, as a humanity has reached a place where all humans can kind of think about it, right? I kind of feel that the thought of itself of thinking of meaning itself is a privilege. Not everybody can actually have the resources, or in a level of it's not like all over the world, still people there in a economically suffering who doesn't have the privilege to think about meaning. They just exist and live, and go day to day, and live on wages, and and day by day, right? So for me, so I'm someone who think about and how we can minimize that, going forward in the next 50 years, in the next 100 years, whether we could minimize that, of course, when you have that privilege, when you are in a better economic solution, you do start to think about meaning. I do think about it, but so the reason I asked that is whether we as a human have to do that, or whether we can, like Pamela said, is it possible for some of us to think and help, and help people who are still kind of working and trying to get to that economic level that they can experience more things in life, while other things kind of hanging on us, the climate issues and other issues, so whether do we have time to think about all these deep things, or whether we just exist and try to live a better life in the so much. So there is this dilemma is there, of course. Yeah.
And that's not a bad approach. Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that is a good alternative. Let's focus on getting everyone up to the point where they have the luxury of thinking about, what constitutes meaning. Sorry, go ahead, Ashley.
No, I agree with something very similar, but I think like meaning doesn't have to be this like very like deep things where it's like you sit in a salon, you discuss this like in a philosophical sense, but I think people can find meaning in like the smaller things, like just taking care of the families and the neighbors and loving one another. I don't think it has to be some sort of like greater than thou, like it can be, but I think there's also virtue in taking care of the people you love and just finding meaning in these things.
Yeah, I think there's actually an argument that like we've sort of gotten farther away from meaning as we've gotten perhaps like more, I don't know, economically advanced or something, or perhaps it's like a U curve. It's like we were high on meaning, and then we like sacrificed a little bit of it to get economic advancement. And then like once you pull people back up the ladder of economic advancement, then you can sort of like get back to it. I'm not sure I believe that, but it sort of seems to dovetail with what Ashley just said, in the sense that like I don't think meaning and wealth are sort of necessarily perfectly correlated, and there are ways to find meaning in sort of more local, maybe you might say like more humble or more interpersonal or introspective ways.
Can I just jump in real quick? Does anyone else feel like the word meaning is the word whose meaning you least understand? Because I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hear it used like meaningful activity, and I kind of know how to use the word. So, if meaning is used, then I know what it means in some sense, but it doesn't, it still feels a little bit out of my grasp. I mean, you can try and ground it in hedonism and say it's like a more sophisticated long-term, or maybe it's a meaningful activity is some activity whose reflection is, experientially positively valenced, I guess hedonically or something like that. But that's just like kind of taking a stab at it. I don't know if you guys have any good definitions of the word meaning that kind of makes it a little more concrete, because it seems a little elusive for me.
I mean, one reason it might be difficult to make concrete or define is because it's not a thing that is propositional, which is to say it is not a type of thing that like, it's not that like you're getting the wrong sentences to say about it. It's something that has a different character altogether. And like, that's an idea I was toying with. I put this link in the chat. I was trying to think about how like, you know, sometimes people sort of talk themselves out of having whatever glimmers of meaning in their life that they do in fact experience because they cannot express it clearly to someone else. And then they're like, all those small things wash away. Like, okay, you're taking care of your family, or you're enjoying something, or learning something, but you can't sum it up. Like, oh, I've got a lot of pleasure, or I've got a lot of progress, or whatever. And then they forget about all those glimmers. And so then it looks worse than the situation really is. So, I mean, there are lots of philosophers in this room, but I would say you know, do we even want a better sentence about, you know, what it is? Is there going to be one? Do we even need that? It's kind of a demand for legibility, I would say, that may not be forthcoming, but I don't think it's the case that people who are sort of like materially disadvantaged, like can't afford to think about meaning in life or something like that. It's sort of like a real cartoon of a view. I think that enterprise is different, right? Like if you are literally like an antebellum slave or something, like, no, you're not sitting there like twiddling your thumbs, looking at the ceiling, like talking with your friends about utilitarianism or whatever. But if you look at accounts of people who have really lived in deprived situations, they think about these things, they come up with different answers. We've moved towards this sort of like explicit search for meaning, and some of it is like somewhat neurotic, I think. But it's not clear that it's like better, full stop.
Yeah,
I think oh, sorry, go on. No, please.
I think I would just tend to agree with Pamela that I think, right, as you said, it's something that we know what it means, but it's when you ask like, what is the meaning of life? That's when it gets confused. So I think it's very important for us to pay attention to the context in which we do understand how it's used, rather than kind of snapping ourselves out of understanding the word by focusing on these more abstract things. And I do think it's really worth paying attention to contexts in lives where it does seem that meaning and meaningfulness and, just kind of like how to live a good life are questions that, maybe they're not explicitly asked, but they can definitely be answered, and, not get too into, I think maybe when we're talking about I think it was Mike brought up the idea of maybe there's a U-curve where too much economic prosperity or whatever sacrifices meaning. I think we can get into some of that when we get too theoretical about answering this specific abstracted question as kind of a proposition.
So I agree that, I mean, almost every concept is very fuzzy, and meaning in particular is among the most fuzzy of concepts. So defining it precisely is probably not either possible or even useful, frankly. But I guess the question, keeping in spirit with the conversation at hand, is it related fundamentally to pleasure? Because, right, we're talking about utilitarianism, and for utilitarian, their value theory, generally speaking, is grounded in hedonism, and is grounded in pleasure, well-being, happiness, maybe eudaimonia if you want to take that route too, but that sort of thing. So I guess the question is meaning or meaningful activity, is that an extra value? Do we expand our value theory and include meaning as a new separate value? Or is it in some sense reducible to hedonism? I think that's the particular connection I want to better understand. If you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe to put what I think you're saying, Mike, in a different way is like, if meaning is sort of it's importantly separate from the other values, then it makes sense to worry that you could improve people's lives on a variety of like measurable dimensions, but not improve them in terms of meaningfulness or even damage them in those terms. But if it sort of emerges from the other values or is more closely related to them, that doesn't make as much sense as a worry. If you improve people's lives in whatever else was valuable way, you would get meaning sort of as a part of that, or people would at least be equally as positioned to do that for themselves.
It almost feels like meaning is operating at two different levels here. There's meaning as a value, and the search for meaning is one of the qualifiers of good life, or there's meaning as a framework in which to find value. And I found meaning to be like one of the worst constructed words in the English language. I like legibility. Legibility is something that you can use a little more clearly. Maybe look at it as, meaning is finding a way for your reactions to things, how you feel about things lining up with patterns of cause and effect or something like that. But yeah, meaning is where a lot of philosophical conversations get tripped up, because no one's, it's very difficult. It assumes a meaner, but the way we use it implies something more than just something that happens in our skulls.
What is legibility in the sense that you're using it?
I'm sort of just loosely, this term is popularized by, I think, James C. Scott in that Seeing Like a State book, but it's just the idea that like, he was using it in a political context, like a government or an institution can't really control or draw money from people unless they sort of can sort them and measure them, and like they have records and things like that. It has a broader meaning, which is just like the demand for legibility would be like you would have something sort of neat interpersonally to say about yourself, or sort of like what you value in life or whatever. Like if you were demanded to make it legible, it would be like you have to kind of package it up in a way that makes sense to others, even though maybe it already made sense to you, even though it's hard to conceptualize. So
sort of coherent, communicable.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not clear like it's not neutral. So there are costs and benefits to legibilizing anything. When citizens became legibilized politically, they got benefits from their government changing, but they also exposed themselves to risks like taxes.
Right, or like all the forestry examples he uses, like, okay, that makes sense. I get it.
And so if meaning is, when people are trying to make meaning in life legible, it may be like not your fault that you can't say it if it's sort of an inherently illegible thing.
Right.
It's not your fault if you can't explain it to someone. That doesn't mean you don't have any meaning to your life. But if that's true, it may be very difficult, even if it's that difficult now, to talk to like a living person about what is meaningful for them. How difficult does that make to think about how it may or may not impact like future people living under wildly different material and social and spiritual conditions? Harder still.
Yeah. Like, is it possible to even express it without abstracting it so much that you sort of aren't really expressing it, right? Like you sort of, it sort of degrades, it's ineffable. It's like an incredible acid trip or a great dream. You could never really bring somebody into it, verbally or whatever. You sort of have to experience it. Yeah, I appreciate what you just said, by the way, about will future people's lives be so different that the way that they construct meaning or the way that they think of their lives as valuable would sort of be so different from ours that it's hard to be prescriptive or say, oh, I wish this for them, or I wish that for them. But, at least at like the application layer, because it's just so hard to know, what they would want or what it would be like to be a person who was happy to have the life that they had in the future, which is, I guess, kind of why I come back to like existential risk stuff. It's like, I can't be super prescriptive about like what a person's life ought to be like in 500 years, but like
I think they at least ought to have a chance at living it. So like, let's just not blow ourselves up.
Do people find the good lives of people who lived 10,000 years ago before us to be legible in this way that we're talking about?
That's a great question, because I think people really differ a lot on this. Like, if you described the conditions of those kinds of life, but then you also posited, you know, they've never heard of a computer or an iPhone, and no one else they knew ever traveled more than 5 miles away either. You know, like, some people are like, yeah, that sounds fine. You know, like, it's all keeping up with the Joneses. So like, that would have been pretty much fine. What would I have known? You know, happiness has a baseline that's sticky and like whatever. And then other people are like, no dishwasher, I'll kill myself, you know, and like, they mean it sometimes. They really mean it. And I think this is related to something I'm hesitant to even use this word because it's like a really loaded word. But sometimes this far future stuff feels somehow related to a broader, like fuzzier conversation over like neoliberalism, which doesn't really have neoliberalism doesn't really have a definition, but I would say one feature of it that people sometimes criticize is that its reliance on neatly legible measures of human progress. Right. So the neoliberal shows up and they're like, oh, 100 years, or not 100 years ago, 50 years ago, a TV cost such and such. And like, also it was a bad TV. And now like anyone who's on food stamps can like go to Walmart and buy a TV. So progress. I mean, I'm caricaturing it, but that's one of the criticisms is like, you're not wrong, that statistic's fine, but it's not capturing something that was lost, like that you had a family that was all near each other or whatever. And so whatever's going on in that kind of back and forth, I think is even messier and harder in the further future if we can't even figure out what's going on values-wise and conceptually about like the difference between post-war America and today America.
Yeah, I'm admittedly a fan of, but also skeptical of like the progress studies movement, right? The sort of Patrick Collison, Tyler Cowen, like, you know, Jason Crawford, like how do we sort of get more progress? And yeah, I think it does struggle to answer questions around sort of value, right? It's like, hey, more economic growth, like penicillin, good, you know, like renewable energy, good, you know, more output per input, good. And maybe doesn't do enough examination of like the downsides or the costs or the trade-offs. I will say though that I kind of directionally agree with it insofar as, and this maybe gets kind of to like what Jiva was talking about before, which is, you know, I do think that, you know, once you sort of climb the hierarchy of needs a little bit and stop having to think so much about your own sort of moment to moment needs, it does become more possible to expand one, you know, circle of moral concern and of compassion. And so I am sort of in the Tyler Cowen camp of like, you know, more GDP growth equals good because it opens up more possibilities, not necessarily that like every single future that has more GDP will be better, but that at least sort of lays the groundwork for more resources to then go accomplish whatever it is you want to accomplish, but it's not, you know, in itself a guarantee of a better future.
I just want to kind of come back to that because Mike just to connect with what Pamela was saying also. The thing is, the reason I kind of asked the question is, you know, the meaning is, I know it's very abstract, you know, we are still, you know, we have like to, here itself, we kind of find it, you know, it's hard to kind of agree on that. Pamela was also saying, you know, so like, it's not like the people who are in a economically in a different state, you know, or who couldn't, it's not about, they are not thinking at all. They have agency, they do think about it. But my thing is whether they to put it actually in a way. Other day I was kind of in a salon where we were speaking about this nearly decomposable system of Herb Simons. So in it he explains about this thing of, you know, of sensed state versus processed state. So you kind of sense something, and you just go with that. It still stays as abstract, but you continue to move. But then there's a process state to work on it to get to that. So the fight is always, when it comes to complex things, sensing and trying to bridge that sense state is a process state. So but thinking about meaning. So people who are in is it needed? Whether they can be happy just by being, it being, whatever thoughts that they come to it, if they do think about, they do have worries, they do have feelings and needs, that they will be thinking on a day-to-day basis, but does it help to think more, whether it would help them to go forward and achieve something or something like that, or does it adds worry to them? Is it adds, whether that search for meaning adds suffering to their hearts, especially when the system is against them, okay, when they when they are struggling economically, and they don't see in the near future things gonna change for them. So this search for meaning, whether it can stay just say as abstract, or if they start to search, whether it would be helpful, or whether it would lead to more suffering and pain.
To look at meaning on the level of finding a framework for judging possible futures, what do you think is the best way to increase happiness for as many people as possible? I'm curious, because it's good to develop these things out and see, is this where we want to go, and how can we get there?
Yeah, actually, I was when I joined, my interesting start question was also, if you're going to play kind of a together, iterate and ideate something, and kind of see where it goes. I was going to ask actually, how do you see, the next 25 years going to be? So based on what path we take, then we can think about the add 24 years to it. So I think that's how I would like to go. I don't, as I said, I think you can't just imagine like how it's going to be in 500 years. But I do feel, the way I'm not sure. I mean, the collaboration wise, as humans, how we collaborate. Pandemic was an example where how it kind of shows. It's like this. Like a case study to humanity, and apart from all the things that happened, how badly we failed in collaborating. We did it, but still, we could have been so much better. And yeah, so now keeping there is this case study still that is going on. Still, in many countries we are failing so much badly after kind of boasting about being. Myself, from India, country that boasted itself from, managing the COVID really well, but now struggling with the, the second wave now the recently Delta. So keeping this case study itself, how we as a humanity, what can we learn from this? How we can kind of, the first thing would be to see is, how we can kind of, the first step would be to see how we can collaborate while keeping the differences aside. Otherwise I don't see. Still, we'll be building the frameworks for that culture or the country. Because if we continue to build frameworks, that is only for for certain culture, or if it's coming from only from a certain region, it's gonna if it's gonna be westernized or Eastern thought, if it's gonna be like based on a certain political belief or religious belief, it's gonna be only for one group of people. So the first step should be to how we are going to create a system, or how we going to create a thought process that is going to be helpful for more humans than only just that's going to benefit one group of people. So.
Maybe I'll join in on that, because I think it's a great question. This kind of question of this sort of question of like looking for sort of a universalizable kind of way to think about improving the human condition or the condition of other sentient beings, moral patients, whatever, in a way that avoids sort of an imperial or kind of parochial sort of projection of just some very local and very contingent kinds of values. And of course, I guess that's one of the things that sort of I think motivates a lot of utilitarian thinking, is the sense that it's really quite critical that we avoid kind of the prejudices of the current moment and our sort of local conditions, and that we find some kind of way to transcend those. And I guess so Bentham, when he started when he was writing, he was kind of responding to some really horrific kind of conditions and really outrageously awful kind of suffering that was being created in his eyes, sort of on the grounds of just extreme and sort of highly irrational forms of religious prejudice. So people were being hung for being gay, and so on. And so he was kind of looking for a principle that he could kind of, it's funny, it's interesting to ask like whether you should read Bentham as actually sort of, you can read him kind of metaphysically as sort of making a claim about sort of what ultimately matters, or you can read him kind of politically as just thinking, okay, well, what's the common ground here? Like, what kind of principle can I start with that I can more or less like compel everybody to buy into? And once I have that principle, perhaps we can kind of use that to clear away some of the worst features of the status quo, and perhaps build something better. And so of course he gets to sort of the principle of utility, and that does actually, it's surprising how much you can do with that. You sort of, if you just insist on bringing it back to this question of sort of suffering and happiness, you can get quite a way. So I guess a theme from the discussion so far is sort of, and I suppose I was kind of suggesting it a bit in the reading, is this idea of kind of using sort of utilitarian principles as a kind of as one baseline for thinking about these things. Okay, actually, no, I'll just go slightly different direction, which is that so we have this thing of like sort of particular human minds and particular human like generations. Particular kind of human communities that Jeba was pointing at. But then, of course, we also have sort of parochialism across time. So earlier generations would have like very different values to us. Like maybe think about the ancient Greeks. And then presumably future generations will also have like quite different values from us, at least at some sort of high, sort of superficial day-to-day level. And then of course, let's think about the space of possible minds, which may also have a rather wide variety of values that might seem quite foreign to us. And so for me, like one of the big sort of background questions that's sort of interesting when I'm thinking about hedonism is is it the case that many, most, or even all possible minds would kind of recognize the truth of the claim that sort of pleasure and suffering matter? Like it might not be that they would all accept that that's all that matters, but we'd already have like quite a lot if we thought that many, most, or all possible minds would care about pleasure and suffering to some degree. And I'm really curious to hear what you folks think about that. Do you think it's plausible that most minds would buy into something like this?
It seems like any mind that has a reward mechanism would have something at least structurally similar to what we would call pleasure. Like, I don't even know if my pleasure is the same as your pleasure. Like, I can't access your consciousness, you can't access mine. But we do know there's some sort of positively veiled, experience that we all feel, and it seems to be very closely related to reward mechanisms in the brain. So, I mean, it's tough to say with certainty, but I think I have a strong intuition that any mind, at least any evolved mind that has some sort of, I don't want to say utility function, but something approximating it, would have to have some sort of reward mechanism built in. So I think every mind is probably at least partially hedonistic. Like you said, we could have further values. We might not be value monists. We could be pluralists. But that's where I would stand on that question. But to take it a little bit further, I think the real question is that I can't remember what Sidgwick calls it, but that divide at the end of his book, at the end of the Methods of Ethics, where he says, I basically can't bridge the gap between, I guess you could call it egoism, like hedonic egoism. I think he calls it empirical egoism, and utilitarianism. So it's basically the difference between I care about the well-being of myself and of those close to me, because it's likely we're not 100% selfish, just on evolutionary grounds. I care about, in the language of utilitarianism, I care about my utility function, and my utility function is, at least somewhat coupled with those of those around me, versus the utilitarian perspective, which is just like, let's aggregate it somehow. It could be total, average, prioritarian, whatever you want to call it, and we optimize that. I think that, to me, assuming that we all are kind of hedonistic, at least in some sense, that to me feels like the real question, because it's the fundamental question of, actually I can turn my camera again. It's that fundamental question of, why be moral? If I want to do X and you say, hey, the correct moral theory says you have to do not X, like, what can you even say to me? What can you say to anyone? Seems like, at least the way I look at morality, is that morality is supposed to provide you some sort of reason that ultimately culminates in you being convinced to do an action you were otherwise not planning on doing. So that's where that bridge, or that divide, comes into play, is how do you bridge that gap if the, quote unquote, correct moral theory is telling you to do one thing, but your actual values and desires would have you do another thing. That to me feels like the more important question. But I don't know if anyone has anything to say on that, or Peter's original question of, are we all necessarily at least partially hedonistic? I'd love to hear what you guys think.
One of the things that occurs to me when you bring up the idea of, utility function and reward functions is sort of, I was thinking as you described, and I was wondering, if we look at the examples we see from, people who research AI, right? We have these, like these reinforcement learning algorithms, and they do have a reward function, but, would you necessarily call that pleasure? I mean, the number is going up, so like you can see the reward go up in real time as your experiment runs. But is that really pleasure? And then, if you take it a step further, what if you had some sort of some other experiment going where you just had your model or your agent basically with a set of preferences, but not necessarily any sort of reward attached to it, and their task is essentially just to carry out, just to do things in line with their starting set of preferences as well as they can. And I guess you could sort of like glue on a reward function onto that, if you like, just for glue on the reward function to like how well you can carry out your preferences, how well you can make the world into that shape. And you can say like, oh, the closer you get, the more reward you have. But just a set of preferences by default, without like an explicit reward function, also seems plausible in terms of, you could, maybe there's a mind like that. And so like, is there necessarily such a strong connection between, you know, hedonism, if you take away the possibility of having some sort of reward function, or maybe like a very alien feeling reward function that's all like spelled out and everything? That was something that is on my mind. So I guess I lean a little bit more towards, you know, maybe they're separate, and it's just part of it's just like biology, just the way like we've evolved.
Could you spell out just a little bit, because I'm not familiar on?
Oh, sure.
I do machine learning, but I don't know anything about preference. I guess satisfaction would be maximization. That's reward function again. Preference satisfying ML algorithms or reinforcement learning agents. How does that work? Because it seems like you can utility functionize that. Is there a way of not doing that? Like, is there a set of preferences that cannot be cast in terms of a utility function? I don't know how the algorithms work. If you know at high level, I'd love to.
Oh, I mean, like I don't do ML research myself, but something that can't be cast into reward function. I guess if you had a set of preferences that were somehow intransitive, that would probably be something strange, because then you can't, because, you know, you can't have one, you can't just say everything is a number and like something's higher or lower if there's like a weird set of preferences that you can just keep going around and around in circles. So I'm wondering if you could theoretically have a set of intransitive preferences, and that might work.
I think you answered it with intransitive preferences.
Maybe.
Because like, how do you, I mean, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, but C is not greater than A, I think you can order them that way. Yeah. I mean, that's at least possible.
Yeah, I mean, but well, to be fair, to my knowledge, I've never heard of anyone saying we're going to train an AI with intransitive preferences and see how that turns out.
I just don't think we know how to. I don't think we know how to. Because like when you train in ML, you're optimizing, right? You have some number you want to get higher or lower. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how that would work. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it seems like to some extent humans are kind of like that. Mm-hmm. Or maybe that's just, you know, hiding the fact that our preferences change temporally, mm-hmm. which is honestly kind of more likely, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. So what Peter's question was, is it possible to have non-pleasure valuing or seeking minds? It seems possible. The question is, like, do any of them exist that we know of? Maybe we're one. I don't know.
I mean, it mostly depends on what you're willing to pack into pleasure or not. It's messy because some things seem worth characterizing in terms of varieties of pleasure, but then other things start to look a little less conceptually close. You know, I thought I maybe saw the direction Peter was going, and so I was trying to think, like, do you have any evidence from just like actual other minds? And I have a dog and a cat, right? It's like, what? My cat doesn't really like agree to things, but I can tell when she's better or worse. I recently got her Prozac, actually, which is like a thing you can do for an anxious cat. It's not cat Prozac, it's actual Prozac. And, it made her happier. Like, she stopped doing the behavioral things that suggested she was very unhappy prior to that. But like, even in the cat, the way that she behaves when I open up the can of like the world's cheapest cat food, she's like so excited, right? But then other times, even an animal will do something pleasure oriented that seems to have a different quality. Like if the animal is curious about something, so there's like a weird noise, that doesn't seem pleasurable in the sense that the stinky cat food is. but like she will sometimes move towards things that are interesting. So like is interesting, do we want to pack that into pleasure and then have a very like multifaceted concept that's not as action guiding when we say that all sort of minds would sort of get this or accept this as reasons? Or do we want to keep it out, you know, keep things like being curious or being hungry or being contented? If you kind of keep those out of the pleasure cluster, then this idea seems more controversial, you know, that pleasure is the thing that everyone would consent to. And so it's in some ways like a strategic choice. And in other ways, you want to do justice to ordinary language. And like, I don't know.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, actually. I mean, even phenomenologically, like, I mean, dancing feels different from reading a book, which feels different from having a good conversation with someone, which all the things we'd cast as pleasurable, straight up just feel different. I mean, phenomenologically, they don't feel the same. So having one word of preference, of pleasure, and casting everything as subservience, that doesn't really seem to hit the mark. Maybe preference satisfaction is a little bit closer. And then I guess you could utility functionize that, but that would just be out of theoretical simplicity or because it feels nice. I don't know.
I mean, the problem is if you do it just as preference satisfaction, then most people, especially like economists who are in this area and stuff, they think that that's fully subjective. That sort of like preferences are like very black box-ish, where there's like nothing really meaningful to interrogate about where they came from. So if you actually have a preference over something moral, then yours ends up looking sort of like equally as important potentially as someone's whose is more like, please, I don't want to be tortured by a slow death from XYZ disease, when common sense says that those two preferences are not really equal. I mean, I'm playing both sides of the coin here because like I'm not decided about this issue, but the more you pack in as being acceptable to pleasure, the more agreement you would get on the basic hedonic perspective, but then the less it actually settles any actual cases about what we should do today, let alone a long time from now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel a bit bad about not sort of throwing out like my sort of working definition of pleasure. You know, obviously that, you know, there's a whole like philosophical literature and debate on this. The Stanford Encyclopedia article on pleasure is actually kind of good, if I remember correctly. But the thing I had in mind is kind of like Sidgwick's account, where it's pretty broad. He talks about pleasure as desirable consciousness. And yeah, there's definitely, you know, a good question about whether there's really kind of, you know, a unity here. But I mean, one way to get sort of juice that intuition is just to remember that, you know, pleasure is not is not a sensation. You know, sensation is kind of thought of as this sort of neutral thing, which like requires interpretation, you know, to generate a kind of feeling. And it's like the feeling is, we can think of sort of desirable consciousness as involving this kind of positive valence, like feeling, a feeling of sort of approach, I want more of this, etc. I guess you can sort of, there's a bit of kind of empirical stuff that might inform this kind of discussion, because allegedly, I've not really looked at this, but I understand there's a kind of sense that we basically have like a kind of approach and avoid kind of set of systems that get like activated or not. So the idea is that, yeah, that there's like a kind of, you know, suffering, displeasure, whatever, that's sort of a kind of, you know, withdrawing and a you know, I would prefer not to have this experience. And pleasure is like, you know, I'd rather have this experience than be unconscious, if that's my only two options or something like that. Yeah, I think, you know, this is definitely a central kind of question. You know, this one of the Kata, well, I don't know how to say this lady's name. This Polish lady whose second name is something like Ozari Radek. She's actually got a book on pleasure coming out like pretty soon. I think it's only in Polish, right now, but it's likely, due out in English like fairly soon. So yeah, I guess I'm curious if we take pleasure as desirable consciousness as a sort of working gloss, does that help, for example, you, Pamela, to sort of be like, sure, my cat, like I want pleasure for my cat and not suffering for my cat.
Well, I mean, it's fine. Like, I'm on board with that. I just think it doesn't do much to settle big questions later if you have the desirable view of pleasure, because it bakes in that you might have to be deciding between things that have different character, which is also fine, because I actually think this stuff is very, like, is not in fact has a unity or should be easy to decide or anything. It's also complicated by this thing I learned recently. I don't know if you would have encountered this, Peter, or anyone else, about this avoid and approach stuff, but there's some weird findings from like addiction people that wanting something and liking it come apart on sort of a physiological level, such that addicts come to really want, they really want the substance, but they really dislike it. And if that's true, that's very confusing, because it's like, it sort of matters whether someone is really so they desire the thing, that's the preference they're registering, but if they actually hate it and not like it, the common sense view is that they must really like it if they want it so much. But this suggests that they're like different pathways. And I don't know how often that stuff actually comes apart, like other than, being on heroin, but it suggests something weird physiologically. So yeah, I don't like have a neat direction with this. Just that I think the more you do to try to get more people on the pleasure, the hedonism train, the less powerful it is as a decision-making mechanism. But I've said that in various ways a few times.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I'll just do a quick response. I mean, like I don't know. I guess I sort of feel like you do get quite a lot if you can just get universal assent to this. As I say, I think Bentham used this to sort of make arguments about not prosecuting consensual sexual acts, no matter what gender is involved. Likewise, some of his sort of his fans also sort of used it to make arguments for sort of universal suffrage, various abolition of various kinds of oppression of women and so on. And I guess and I presume sort of when of our pets and animals and so on, it also, again, it's just like, well, wait, are these like factory farms? Something we can be sort of neutral or even positive about, because they're creating all this delicious food for us. So for me, I think as like I sort of have a pretty strong set of kind of pluralistic instincts at heart, and so for me, it's sort of, I'm actually pretty relaxed about granting, if I'm going to say anything is intrinsically important, I'm pretty happy to start by saying sort of pleasure and suffering, should be at the top, should be sort of on the list. The thing that I get very nervous about is it's saying that that's the only thing that is important. And yeah, again, I'm kind of curious, and I suppose, as I say, the question I was sort of trying to like throw out for the room was this question about like, to what extent other people kind of feel like, sure, it might not be the only thing on the list, but it should surely be on the list, and how plausible that seems to people. And I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more from others about how they feel about that.
I tend to be pretty skeptical of pleasure as being enough to unify kind of all possible minds, right? I think I can definitely imagine that there could be an argument that if we somehow find a very, very good definition of all possible minds, that there is some mechanism that's absolutely required for this that does include pleasure. But I don't feel convinced by the arguments out there. And then there just seems to be so much potential diversity with what counts as a mind and what we'd want to recognize as a mind. I do find it fairly easy to imagine, right, people who have some kind of neurological switch flipped so that they're still functioning but are not experiencing pleasure or pain in any particular way. And then just looking at other ways that people have imagined even human minds, or I think of Kant's version would be all rational beings, all rational minds. And I do think that, right, he would make the argument that you can still do action, still do ethical action, that actually your ethical action should be entirely distinct from calculations of pleasure and pain. So it's not hard to imagine that there could be an intelligence. And then I'd also just point to, you can argue about the meaning of possibility here, but the traditional Theravadan, like Buddhist monk claim is that once someone has attained the status of an arhat, of enlightenment, that they experience neither pleasure nor pain, but are still very much beings. And you could there's definitely arguments that can defeat those, but I just do not feel confident enough about defining other minds to say that. I still do want to chip in and say there's something, right? All of these definitions notably do have some kind of end state or goal that they're insisting that is still possible without pleasure and pain, that it's beyond pleasure and pain. So I'm happy to kind of take just a pluralistic definition of, we can agree that there's something that people are going to be chasing after, but I'm cautious about being so kind of well defined on it. It definitely includes this one thing.
I'll ask a provocative question then. Some people, proponents of so-called kind of suffering-focused ethics, are sort of mainly, or perhaps entirely, concerned with reducing the sort of the amount of negative experiences or suffering in the world. And if you want to be really risk averse, it's funny, most people worry, some people who think about the future worry that we're going to evolve towards a situation where we'll, all of the agents that are sort of around will just not have consciousness at all. So in a sense, it'll be kind of back to how the universe was before, where it was just stuff happening, but nobody around to witness it. And for a lot of people, that's a great source of worry, because it seems like we've lost the preconditions, the enabling conditions for any kind of value to be realized in that world. But I guess if you're going to deny the pleasure or pain, if you're going to try to push the idea that pleasure or pain is not on the list of things that matter, I guess the provocative response to that would be something like, okay, shall we just play it safe? Because maybe suffering is bad, right? So maybe we can just play it safe and just engineer out all experience from the future. But hopefully, and let other potential values be realized. We have lots of great art, but just nobody to see it, because if they saw it, they might suffer. So if we're really concerned with suffering, this is kind of crazy talk, or something close to that to my mind. But I was just curious to throw that out and see if that helps anyone.
Again, the thing is, thing with suffering again is it's the same way meaning. It has its own different way of seeing the suffering itself. Suffering that has come out of pain and trauma is there, but then when you actually choose to suffer to get better, do some work, and that kind of a suffering is also there. So, so in a way, if you think like that, so suffering as a thing that is come out of pain and trauma, that is not controlled by you. You do want to see, I kind of see that is something you want to take away, but then but I am someone who think, but you can't take away the pain. You can do whatever you can do to not take away the suffering. I think that is good. If that is something we can do to help people, not go through suffering, that is great. Because I think pain is, whatever the experience, whatever the trauma, whatever based on their life or experiences, whatever the pain that is, the pain is going to be there. It's not. I don't think it's taken away, right? But I think it's good to take away the suffering. If there is something that can be done that would take away all the suffering, I think that's a great thing. I don't think it anyway kind of deletes the experience of pain. I think, yeah.
I think I'm a bit hesitant to cast suffering as like a black and white, like purely bad thing that we should eliminate. I keep thinking about, like, I think it was Nojik's like experience machine, like the pleasure machine thought experiment, where he said, like, if you were given the option to like plug into a machine where you could basically I think just like create any like desirable or pleasurable experience, like, would you? And I feel like most people would be hesitant because there's like some like artificiality to it, or it's like some concept of, oh, you didn't earn these pleasurable experiences, you're kind of, it's like a machine created thing, where like, say if you worked hard and you were like forced yourself into some sort of like strenuous period of your life, but you knew at the end there would be some reward to it, like that would be much like better than just like artificially creating it by plugging into a machine. So I feel like it's kind of not only just like the matter of like maximizing quantity of pleasure, if that's a value that we hold, but also differentiating between different like qualities. Like I think it was Bentham's like pushpin and poetry kind of thing, where he's like, if should we differentiate between the qualities of the amount of like pleasure a like baser like child game of pushpin, if that's gives you the same amount of pleasure as consuming like poetry or something more sophisticated or elevated. Do we just count the quantity of pleasure it gives us, or should we also take into consideration like what type of pleasure it is, if it's earned through suffering or if it was just like artificially created?
Almost takes us back around to meaning, because in the pleasure machine example, if you hook yourself up to the pleasure machine, you feel great, but it doesn't mean anything. And we can go back and forth about what it means for something to mean something, but we can all be pretty sure that wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna. I'm thinking the same. The thing is, if you go through suffering to achieve something, if once I think once it becomes a pleasure, there is a satisfaction, right? So if you suffered and you went through something and you have reached this, and if you're able to have that achieve some kind of a satisfaction, then it becomes a pleasure. Then you don't worry about going through that suffering. But the suffering that's where I kind of see this differently. Pain and the suffering as a separate thing. The reason is the suffering that stays, that you can't kind of get away, that you feel that that kind of this thing that you feel like on a day-to-day basis that eats you. That kind of suffering is not that doesn't have end, because it even if it comes through a good thing you try to do in your life, it is there probably because you didn't reach that end. You went through all the hard work, but then at the end, you didn't see the light. Then it becomes a suffering, right? So it stays with you and it eats you. So that's how I see that. So even if you did it for some good thing, okay, you say, let's say you wanted to do some work and you worked for many years, but then everything went to shit, thanks to pandemic. So then it becomes a thing, all this hard work is now become a suffering, right? So now how do you get away with that? So that's how I kind of see, suffering and pain. Pain is, I kind of see, pain can turn into a pleasure, if you put that hard work, all those time and be able to reach this at least some form of thing that be able to, at the end of the, you feel somewhat satisfied. I think you can like coming back to it because it kind of connects to the meaning you kind of are connected to that. You feel it all worked out in the end. So yeah.
Actually, it's kind of interesting. Sorry, Ethan, did you want to say something? Okay, cool. Ashley, it's kind of interesting you bring up, while we're talking about the nature of like suffering and what do we want to do about that, and is it something to get rid of? It's interesting you bring up also like the quality of pleasure, and I kind of have a snarky answer and a non-snarky response. Sure, I guess I'll start with the snarky response first. Basically, how I resolved it when I first encountered this thing was we'll just get rid of the unnecessary parts of suffering, and then whatever is necessary suffering is necessary, and therefore we have solved the problem. The end. The actual serious response that came to mind was sort of, it's interesting that quality of the pleasure comes up, because it seems like a lot of the stuff around suffering is sort of, as mentioned before, is sort of like avoiding the bad situation, and there's comparatively little in terms of like, how do we get to something that's a really good state? So it seems like there's a lot of like spirituality stuff or what have you that's about going from like negative to zero, and then there's very little in terms of like getting from zero to like 1,000,000 or something. And that's I think that's one of the critiques that I come across a lot. Like, I don't know, maybe from like some Buddhist monk where you have to like go into the mountains and meditate and basically give up the entire world, which, I don't know, maybe it gets rid of the suffering, but then you also can't exist in the world anymore, which is sort of a very strange proposition. So I'm wondering, it's kind of weird that a lot of the focus is on suffering rather than going above that. And I don't know if it's like a result of the fact that, Buddha lived thousands of years ago, and, maybe things weren't so great back in the day. You didn't have, pleasures like pushpin or poetry or cocaine or video games. So that's something that came to mind, like that sort of asymmetry in what people focus on.
I think it's also interesting because when talking about kind of higher pleasures, that there's, in a lot of the Buddhist examples, right, the going off in the mountains to, encounter the end of suffering is also always described as being fundamentally truth-seeking, that actually the person out in the mountains is experiencing reality to a greater extent than people who are kind of back in the world. And this is kind of what I was thinking about, is that, I do have a inherent reaction against one way to increase pleasure, right, would be to put everyone in virtual reality pods or something, or in experience machines, and give them all these experiences. And I do want to say there's something wrong about that. And even I would have kind of the hope that, people 10,000, like, I think that to a certain extent, we definitely look at a little bit strangely at experiences which are in some ways virtual or not engaged with reality. And I think there is even something to an extension of lives that are foreign to us. In that, like, I'm thinking of, if there's a ancient Egyptian laborer who's very, very satisfied with their lives because not only have they helped their family, but they've helped the pharaoh build his great monuments, which, is essential to the metaphysical order of the universe. And I think a lot of us would regard those beliefs as somehow not quite right. But I actually hope that the people of 10,000 years from now might look back on us with some of the same angle of, like, somehow the pursuits that we're after that give us pleasure, give us meaning, are not quite on the mark, and that they've kind of found a deeper engagement with reality, like those Buddhist monks who see the meditations and the rituals as being about, here's what's actually real and true, as opposed to these, not only is the world more pleasurable, but it's all rather full of pain. but it's also in some ways more false. That was a bunch of ideas, so feel free to ask me to elaborate or just ignore it.
I do want to tack on something to the experience machine comment. So there's a common objection to that, which is, what if you're in the experience machine right now? Would you unplug? Because I wouldn't. This is all fake by that, but like I wouldn't unplug. So I don't know if like what's real is what constitutes what's meaningful. Maybe it's just that we're familiar with this, and the thought experiment is just so radical. The experience that you would undergo in the experience machine is just so radical that it's just hard for us to place our headspace and to take the right perspective there, because it's fundamentally different. I mean, are we talking the experience machine where like you're basically on heroin 24/7, or are we talking the experience machine where you plug in and you're a rock star with billions of dollars and a family that loves you, and where it has more of those like meaningful components? It's really tough. It's really tough, and I don't know if the idea of what's real is what grounds our preference here. And then, but I also do want to circle back to the comment that Peter made about Sidgwick's definition of pleasure, because I really do think this is the crux of a lot of the philosophical issues here. And it's something I'm working on myself. Like I'm trying to figure out like a hierarchy of moral concepts. I'm trying to write an essay, but it's taking forever. And I mean, the way I see it, it's like you have the first question is like, what should you do? And then, what's right? Well, what's right? What do you have most reason to do? And what do you have most reason to do? That which is most pleasurable, let's say, or optimizes your pleasure utility function or whatever. And what's pleasure? Well, it's desirable consciousness. Great. Well, what's desirable? And that's kind of where we left it off. And I think that's, we got to keep digging. I definitely want to keep digging personally, because that's why I think a lot of the knots are going to be tied up in finally hitting bedrock, if there is a bedrock. And one idea is, okay, desirable consciousness is our states of consciousness which you would wish to persist. And it's like, what is wishing? What is wanting? It keeps getting deeper and deeper, and I don't think any clarity has been added. But I do have a very strong intuition that a lot of the issues that constitute moral theory come down to really trying to hit bedrock, if there is a bedrock, or maybe doing a completely different paradigm shift and operating in that. So I don't know, do you guys have an idea of how to understand what desirable means, or maybe the angle is completely wrong in the first place? I do feel like this is very, very crucial to understanding a lot of these knotty issues.
I had a quick, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I just had a quick comment on like your first point about like what's real. It made me think about like transhumanism almost. I think it's like how much of ourselves and our lived experience can we change or alter, like whether it's through like drugs and alcohol or like putting a chip in our brains before it's not considered real. And I feel like I've always been a little bit skeptical about like the transhumanist like optimism about like, oh, we can really like perfect the human, like perfect humans through technology, because I feel like I don't know where we can draw the line between like how much of ourselves you can alter before we're not really considered human. I don't know, sorry, that was like a big digression, but I wanted to throw that out there before that comment got lost.
I was just going to say, these things are all a lot easier to define subjectively than objectively. We can say, this is desirable to me, this has meaning to me, this is pleasurable to me. But when we start trying to define it for minds in general, we run into the problems of, do these concepts refer to the same phenomena in all minds? And even, is this even productive to try to find answers to these questions that apply to all minds? So yeah, that bedrock is difficult to locate.
I have kind of a slightly different question, and if this is derailing the conversation, I'm happy to table it for later. I'm curious, like, given all of these considerations, like, is it possible to undertake projects that, like, you know, I don't know, have the possibility of allowing for kind of more desirable futures in whatever ways that they could be defined? And I think, like, as we've discovered, it's not totally easy to define them, but is it possible to sort of be actionable or entrepreneurial about these things, or is that a fool's errand?
What do you mean by entrepreneurial about this?
Well, we're sitting here having a conversation. Like, can we do anything about it? Like, literally, if all of us said, okay, for the next 5 years, we're going to sort of work towards building more beautiful futures in whatever way that we think that, whatever we think that means, like, what would one do?
I'll definitely vote for moving from the purely philosophical a little closer to the practical.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate you sort of steering us a bit in this direction, or at least raising this, because I guess this is kind of where I was hoping we might be able to sort of spend our last sort of 30 to 60 minutes. And I was sitting here wondering when I should make that steer, but I say, why not? Let's go there now. I don't know. That said, there is just one thread I'd like to sort of personally just sort of say something about, you know, that came up in sort of something that Christian said. In response to Ashley on the experience machine thing. I think this idea that the experience machine thought experiment is mostly telling us about something about our attachment to the status quo and our kind of fear of really radical change is pretty important. And I think it comes up as well, you know, when you're thinking, you know, there's this concept, I don't know where this came from actually, but there's this idea of kind of inferential distance in sort of social epistemology or something. And the idea is that, you know, if you share a lot of premises and a lot of priors, then it's very easy to have a conversation. But if you have gone like a long way down the rabbit hole on a particular area, it can actually become like very difficult for you to communicate with somebody who has not had that experience. Because you're going to say things that sort of seem obvious to you given your priors, and your interlocutor is really going to have a hard time, you know, starting to sympathize, or even understand. And I think there's a sort of similar thing where, you know, if we think our way back, you know, Tom Holland likes to go on and on about just how hard it is for us to understand. This is Tom Holland, the historian, author of Dominion. He goes on and on about just how hard it is to for us to really get ourselves in the mindset of sort of the ancient Greeks or the Romans, given that we're now kind of in this sort of highly Christian sort of kind of water that, of sort of contemporary culture. And he just thinks that, like, you know, if you really try, if you really read the letters, and if you and so on, it starts to almost feel like you're sort of speaking to kind of aliens or something. That you actually realize there's like really, really deep differences in sort of the ways they're thinking about things and their sensibilities and so on. But of course, you know, we're going to have a similar problem looking forwards. And so I sort of wonder, you know, it's like there's this thing. I think it's sort of helpful to think about sort of just like how it works with like parents and grandparents and their children. So like you have this like familiar dynamic where sort of the parents and the grandparents are sort of have this thing of like, oh, kids today, like they don't care about like like what's good and good, what is sort of right and proper. Like all they care about is Justin Bieber and TikTok or whatever. And this dynamic just like plays out, you know, between grandparents and their grandchildren. You know, and we're all familiar with it. But if you kind of extend down, if you imagine like grandparents and their great grandchildren, you can imagine the sort of mutual incomprehension being even more severe, to the point of, if not horror, then you know, like really quite extreme sort of suspicion and doubt and perhaps regret, where I don't know. You might think that certain kinds of religious values that sort of are very central to your worldview are just now seen as ridiculous by your great grandchildren and so on. And so I wonder if, I actually think I saw some of this theme as I was reading the Scheffler stuff, where like, I just wonder if at a certain sort of, if you, like when you have like one step of change, you can sort of understand it and we can kind of evaluate it and sort of be happy or sad about it. But when you've had sort of 1,000 steps or 1,000,000 steps, there comes some point at which it's just kind of incomprehensible. And so I think we kind of default to sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt when we try to think that far into the future. And this to me seems like a pretty big problem for thinking about the longer term. And I just don't really know what to do about it. Maybe to link it back to Mike's sort of question about like, okay, let's get practical. So my personal solution, actually, I do have a solution for this. My personal thing is just like, well, maybe you don't need to have like a really clear vision of like where you're trying to get to. And maybe it's just enough to, come up with a sense of, well, on the margin, I'd like to take this step. If we take a couple of steps in this sort of direction, I'm going to be happy with that. And then I'll kind of leave it to people, to some other people once we've taken those steps, to decide where to go next. And I think in spirit, this is very much the sort of thing that Tyler Cohen sort of likes to propose. And I feel like that's the sort of, in a way, the steel man of the progress studies movement, which was mentioned earlier, where they're sort of light on philosophy, but I think it's quite an intentional choice. They sort of don't want to bake in too much at this point, because I think there's actually sort of intellectual modesty to that, where it's kind of like, well, let's just kind of, do what we can, like kind of keep the party going, and sort of trust each generation at each step to sort of, move, hopefully take things forward in a positive way. Sorry, that turned into a much longer kind of thing than I was aiming for, but I hope there was something interesting in there.
When you're saying you like take a few steps forward and then leave it to the others, does that mean you think we should think in like, not like the 500-year span, but maybe like the next 50 years and then just be like the next generation can figure it out? Or what were you trying to go with that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the kind of thing I would endorse. And, it's like my thought for sort of insofar as, I was suggesting we might try to sort of write a manifesto of sorts. The time span I had in mind was kind of, 10 to 100 years, not 100 to 1,000 years. It's like the sort of 100 to 1,000 or 10,000 years sort of frame. I think we should sort of bear it in mind. But when it comes to sort of thinking, okay, well, what should we actually do now? Mike's comment earlier about sort of, well, let's at least not blow ourselves up. That really resonates with me. I mean, that's basically, all of this moral philosophy, like that wasn't actually the stuff that really got me into working at 80,000 hours and sort of thinking the effective altruists were onto something. Really, it was just a very simple kind of like, well, I think this party is kind of good. It can be pretty rough sometimes. And like, I'm pretty fortunate to be like having a good time at this party. But, I see a lot of potential in it, and we should just kind of like keep the lights on for a bit at least. Like maybe at some point, we'll sort of all realize this party just sucks and we should quit. But I'm just going to kind of proceed on the assumption that we should keep it going. And then, my gosh, empirically, there seems to be credible threats to this party. So that not many people are taking very seriously. So let's, why not just that can be a life project, just like try to do something about that. And that's really the reasoning, I was using. I was not doing, kind of totally utilitarian calculations or anything like that. And I think that's true for a lot of people who end up getting into this stuff. And I'm actually a bit like, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I also kind of like that. I also get the way I kind of in my mind, when you say steps is, I also kind of see it that way. You see that many of the problems, that we are facing as humans, in collaborating is it's because of the frameworks and beliefs and laws and systems that has been written by a long time ago, and we are kind of as if it's like a thing that is, can be applied even now. We kind of stick to that. It's still fighting actually, right? And over it, things that is not, there are many good things there, but there are also things that doesn't apply to us anymore, as we progress. So I think the way I see it, if we're gonna build and explore something now, that it would be great to keep it in mind to make sure, that things will continue to change, and the way things we build, and the values that we apply to it, may not be the values people in the future from 30, 40 years, value it. So yeah, I kind of like that. And also just to kind of connect it with Mike's question, and so I kind of think, why not, why not explore, the reason is, you see, I think it's already kind of happening, with the technology and the apps and things, that we are using. There are so many things that is kind of forced on us, but it's coming from one set of people. It's coming from one place. It's coming from people who want to monopolize it, right? And already ideas and things are kind of imposed on us. If that is the case, with the technology now and the connection we have now, you are in this best place where you could actually kind of bring in so many different ideas from diverse group of people in an easier way. Then it's I think it's good to kind of explore, and it's okay to kind of create a unified thought of a futuristic thing. But one thing again has to be, just to connect with the Peter's point, is the steps, not think too far. Not think that whatever we are actually ideating or thinking about will actually solve the problem 70 years from now. Things it will not be applicable then. Yeah, so that is
yeah. No, I appreciate that conception of it, like not saying, oh, okay, I know exactly what problems need to be solved in 500 years, or what life should look like in 500 years, right? Like, I think I try to go for things that feel like a little bit more graspable, a little bit more short term, but that I think directionally I can take a stance on that, that I can feel pretty confident, at least gives us the opportunity to allow, sort of more moral agents to live, lives that they would consider, lovely, wonderful, worth living, free of, more suffering, or closer to unsufferingness or unsatisfactoriness, or whatever you'd want to call it. Maybe it's a Buddhist conception of it, right? So, like, here's some examples. So one is just like mitigating existential and catastrophic risks, like just giving ourselves a shot to get there, and not blowing ourselves up. Or another one might be significant advances in mental health, right? So if you're thinking about, okay, well, how do we define this sort of squishy, subjective first-person well-being? Well, I think in a way, mental health in a broad, more abstract sense, not just from like a clinical sense, is almost synonymous with that. Not quite. I think it's broader, but I think you could say something like, okay, well, depression and anxiety is keeping a lot of people from living flourishing lives, and so what are things that can sort of get a hold of those and maybe get them more under control? And then you can sort of broaden that scope and think, okay, well, I'm a human being who's experienced a broad spectrum of states of being, from sort of panic attack level anxiety all the way to sort of love, to euphoria, to sort of deeper meaningful experiences. And maybe I got those through connections to other humans, from meditation, from psychedelic experiences, right? And okay, I'm not saying that everybody should take psychedelics or everybody should meditate, but those seem directionally worth sort of at least exploring and putting capital behind and putting talent behind, right? And I think you could continue to go down this list, and then you could use, and like, I don't want to be a pure like effective altruism person here, but like I sort of go in that realm. Okay, so if you sort of think about which of those things are important, and then you sort of do some you know, analytical thinking around, okay, well, which of those things seem to be more ignored? Like, where are we not putting resources? Where are really capable builders and doers of things not paying attention to? Well, then you can sort of, you know, think about like which of these causes or projects are neglected, and where would one, you know, where would we say, man, I really wish there was somebody working on that, and sort of start to funnel energy and attention and maybe even sort of like normative cultural coolness towards those things, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I'm a guy who did like only okay in his, you know, philosophy courses in college, but you know, has bias towards kind of like building things, and maybe that's just like the Silicon Valley person in me. But I don't know. I really do think it is possible to put energy and resources and kind of entrepreneurial vigor and analytical thinking behind these things that, yeah, I don't think they're unto themselves guaranteed to make, you know, the future beautiful, but I think that directionally we can feel good about sort of nudging those forward as sort of ways to at least give ourselves a shot at building sort of more beautiful, more well futures.
Yeah, I just also want to just add fast, like, again, I like that, okay, but also as you actually kind of went into the like the positivity side of it, the futuristic, you know, I'm also in the back of I'm kind of thinking, you know, there is this dilemma that comes with it also. For example, now you mentioned about mental health and mental illness, you know. So if you're kind of trying to build something for that, you know, and still again, the mental health is a privilege and it's not accessible, you know. When I say mental health, you know, that is something, you know, people can getting to a psychiatrist or a counselor, you know, it's still a privilege, you know, for many people, you know. You know, so in that case, you know, if you're building something, you know, to let's say you're building something that to make bring people to connect and, you know, make them happy in some way, even if you don't solve the problem fully. But also there is this danger of, you know, you see, you can say Facebook is maybe doing the same thing, but Facebook is also taking advantage of, you know, the same people, you know. So whether it's helping them to have that pleasure, you know, that comes with it, the small pleasure that comes with it, or whether it's actually profiting from them. So that is there also, you know, as you start to, you know, build for, you know, to the masses, and especially, you know, yeah. So for example, right, when you think of, you know, for there is this book, actually, there is this thing I thought of, you know, building for, you know, 1 billion people, you know, that is, you know, people in India and, you know, and now and the Asia, and, you know, people to whom technology is reaching in the last decade, you know, who have access to this many simple, you know, luxuries that comes with, you know, of having a mobile, you know, and able to order food and etc. Right, you know, these things actually is great, you know. It's yeah, but you can't, you know, there is this, you can't actually, but also that the problem is there is this thought of, you know, now especially during the last by the message from the last president of US, you know, so that is, you know, we have this population now, you know, that we are now actually consuming more than, you know, most of the world, you know, so that is kind of contributing to it. But the problem is these people only have access to these luxuries, you know, and able to, you know, enjoy those things in the past decade or so, you know. So how do you? So that is there also, this the dilemma of, you know, the ethics, and the dilemma of the, you know, able to help people to access those luxuries. Yeah.
Sure. And so sorry, was that a direct response to one of the things I proposed, or was that a new thought? By the way, totally fine either way. I just wanted to.
It's not a direct response. I'm just the thing is, when you're being entrepreneurial, I know it's like a tricky place, right? You have to be there is this ethical dilemma that comes with that, but then also the dilemma of, you know, I mean, if we are building something to help people and make them happy, there is there is a lot of things that that comes with it, especially if you are going entrepreneurial. Whether when you're taking it to more people, more masses, whether it's actually helping them or whether it's helping you to become richer. So that
let me just respond to that. So totally agree with you. So let me just respond to that in two ways. So way one is yes, absolutely. Like all of these projects have trade-offs, and I think it would be very silly for somebody to say, oh, I'm working on this thing and it's for the good of the world, and it's not even sort of worth thinking about what the downsides of this or what the trade-offs are. What are the unexpected consequences? What are the second and third order consequences of this thing I'm building? And so absolutely, like I think that has to sort of be baked into the consideration of any entrepreneurial enterprise that one might take on. The second thing I would say is when I use the word entrepreneurial, I don't mean it in a sort of a for-profit sense or a Silicon Valley startup type sense, right? I mean it in sort of like, you know, human agents taking on projects that they think are worth building, right? And that could be a nonprofit, it could be a social movement, it could be a local thing, it could be a scalable thing, it could be a not scalable thing, right? And so I totally agree that a lot of like entrepreneurial enterprises, especially recently, that maybe were sort of fetishized or idealized as good for the world, have had unintended consequences. And I don't know, like maybe Facebook's that way. Like, I don't know, fuck Facebook. Like I hate Facebook, right? So I don't know, like maybe that's overly simplistic. But yeah, when I say entrepreneurial sort of projects, I mean it in a more kind of abstract way versus like, oh, a Silicon Valley venture-backed startup, right? I think that's one very tiny sliver of what that word could mean.
I wanted to try and tie together some things that they're all a little fuzzy in my head, so I'm just gonna riff. So it has to do with what Peter was saying with inferential distance, and it's related to all this entrepreneurial talk, which I agree with. It's definitely very hard to put yourselves in the headspace of people in like the ancient Greek time period, like or Spartans leaving babies out if they were a little deformed. Like it's very difficult to do. But relating to the idea that, you know, morality has to essentially any kind of prescription really has to appeal to values you actually do have, or else they're just not going to have any force. I see some connection with that inferential distance idea in that, you know, we could start from the, let's call it set of values, preferences, or desires, whatever you want to take as bedrock that the Greeks had. They factually did move out of that. Humans factually moved out of that, like because we have different values and desires and preferences now. And it seems like there's a stepping stone. There's several links in this chain that led to where we are now. And so when we're thinking from the current perspective and we're trying to project forward, I think it makes a lot of sense that rather than trying to be like, what are the true values that are the end all be all of conscious experience and morality and, you know, the universe and everything, and try and kind of bake it all in all at once, but rather to start from the values we actually do have and then make those incremental steps, add that next chain link in the chain we're building here that is moral progress, by taking the values we have and saying, okay, maybe we want to be a little reflective, and see which of the sets of values and preferences and desires we have we want to change relative to the entire set. And then also, rather than turning inwards, we can turn outwards and say, let's apply the set we actually have right now, and let's try and make that next step. How do we make that next step? Well, let's be practical about it. Let's actually make some changes in the world. What do we have most control over? Well, the near future. How do we influence the near future? Well, this kind of entrepreneurial mindset, and that could be capital based, that could be for-profit based, that could be whatever, or it could just be, you know, personal projects or what have you. So I think that's one point, that we have to focus on the next step, because that's what we've been doing the whole time anyways. And like maybe we dragged our feet along the way, but we've been doing okay for a bunch of monkeys that fell out of a tree and decided to think thoughts one day. But then the other thing I think is worth emphasizing is there seems to be, unless you're an antinatalist, there seems to be moral convergence on at least one thing, which is what we've been, I think, all agreeing on, which is we want to make sure we're still around. Because if we're going to move the ball down the field a little bit,
We want to make sure someone else can grab that ball, pick it up, and move it down for the next iteration, and on and on and on. So I think we have two problems ahead of us. There's what are the actual practical applicable steps we can take now: mental health, depression, extreme poverty, malaria nets, all those classic EA problem areas. And that's great. We should be focusing on that. But then also pay a little bit of attention in terms of long-term stuff, not to what are the grand values, to the end all be all of all, conscious and moral, theoretical, what's the value set that we ought to have in the extreme. But we know at least one thing. We want to probably be around so that we can figure it out, because we're not going to have all the answers. So let's make sure someone else in the future who will inherit our wisdom can move the ball along as well. So we have those two little prongs I think we can grab onto and start thinking about that in a more practical sense.
But my thought there is, Christian, is it like a puzzle, right? For example, whether is it easy to think that way, to do something now, to so we can be around, or whether it works like, if we're able to think more about it and able to kind of connect the minds, then probably we will take action that will help us to be around 100 years from now. That puzzle is so because the way I kind of still see is we still have these differences, and how we as humans kind of connect and collaborate, is there, right? There is so many differences, between nations, and the idea of nations itself, and the competition between those and those ideologies that is not being helpful to the survival of us. So whether we can actually take these immediate steps without actually thinking about these things. I mean, it's a puzzle that I wonder.
Maybe more practically. So I think in terms of solving the next, moving the ball forward, we already have the mechanisms in place, right? In terms of startups, we have VC and private equity and angel investors. We have the mechanisms are there. Maybe socially you want to encourage more entrepreneurship, or you want to encourage more risk taking, or you want to encourage more out of the box thinking. So that seems very clear. In terms of practically, how do we start thinking about the long term, specifically the convergent moral value of we probably want to exist at least. My intuition, and you guys probably have other ideas here, but my intuition would be, maybe adding to the pool of grants for people who just want to think about that stuff. There are people who already want to think about this stuff seriously. I mean, the effective altruism community is full of those people, and they're very brilliant people. They're very smart people. They're very driven people. So just giving them more resources, that is one way of figuring out how do we keep existing, is to just give, resources and funding and institutional access to people who already factually currently want to think about that stuff. So, grant raising, fundraising, creating, I guess, EA centric incubators. Those seem pretty practical, kind of hands-on stuff to think about the long-term question of existential risk.
Totally. And I wouldn't butt in, but I have to go pretty soon. So I just want to echo on that. I'm working on a project that is something kind of like that, basically saying hey, look, how do we get more capital behind these, even call it meta EA projects, right? Yes, I definitely do want to pursue specific interventions in specific cause areas, but I think there's just a lot of room for getting more resources behind people who want to have the discussions, build things, do the research, do the cause area prioritization research, do the norm building, the community building, how might one do this? And so, totally just want to, I think that's a good idea. In fact, I think it's such a good idea that I'm gonna go work on it. So keep an eye out.
This is
Awesome.
where my
really
cynicism,
cool
my cynicism
Pamela,
really flares.
can I just? Okay, no, don't worry.
Of course.
Go for it, Pamela. My comment is not that important actually. I'd much rather hear what you have to say.
Oh, sure. I was just going to say, this is the type of stuff that makes my cynicism flare, which is oh, you want to do to the far future what people have done to nonprofits. Great. idea, like turn it into this giant area of like grift and status seeking and like, conjecture and like problem solutions that make their own problem, just like, I don't know how to create an environment where sort of like people who actually have any competitive advantage in discerning or predicting the future are not all mixed in with like grifters and power grabbers and people who are doing this instead of like actually doing something concrete, valuable to the present, or like people who maybe had a business that was successful now, but is that the best reason we have to like think that they're the ones who will lead us into the future? I mean, it's some reason to think they have some skills, but I don't even know which, like, I don't even understand what sort of being future ready even means. People talk about this like sort of in terms of education of children, even that they might not even be prepared for like the rather near future. So like, don't teach them specific things, just teach them like critical thinking or whatever. Maybe this is to there was a bit in the reading that Peter gave us. Maybe it's where Bostrom kind of criticizes this thing that these other people said, which was like preparation for the future does not require accurate prediction. It requires a foundation of knowledge, a capacity to learn, attention to the present, and like resilient institutions, right? The idea being that like we could prepare for the future without doing it in any specific way, like just have a bigger economy and like put some money in slightly different places, but like we don't know specifically what's going to happen. And of course, he rightly says that you can't even really do that without some ability to predict. I'm rambling at this point, but when I think about when my cynicism about progress studies and just giving certain people who are good self-promoters more money to like tinker and stuff, I really would like to believe the extremely convenient thing, which is like if we all just keep our heads down and sort of like do a good job of being what we are, then maybe like that actually is the best thing for the future somehow, please. But I'm not fully sold on that either. Obviously, the collective action things are very difficult, like around climate and stuff.
Yeah, I have a question in your experience, because you were in academia, I believe, or you were at least teaching or something. Do you feel that academic philosophy was somewhat effective at doing what it's doing? Because I mean, maybe what Mike and I were proposing, I mean, in my mind, it seems very similar to like in academia in terms of like funding and intellectualizing and writing papers and collaborating and stuff. It seems all the possible cynical takes one could have with respect to this proposition would also apply to academia. So my question is like, do you think it also applies to academia? Like, what's your experience like? Is it effective?
I mean, it depends on what the goal is, which people also don't agree about. There are people who tell you the sensible goal of those academic institutions is like truth or teaching people what they need to know to be functional adults, not so good on that score. I mean, it's an institution with many cross purposes. And then the individuals embedded within it have incentives and purposes that are sometimes at odds with their institutions. This is just like academic philosophers have an unfortunate but understandable tendency to write these like little tiny papers that no one ever reads and that don't really, not like broad theorizing or like what is pleasure, but a lot of it is like really like way in the weeds, and it's like not even wrong, not even exactly wrong, but just sort of like something else. So people don't really know how to fix that, and part of why they don't agree how to fix that is because they also don't agree on the purpose. My view is rather dim. I mean, I'm just like I'm a cynic overall. Like, I think that top-down projects are mostly doomed, that most of the good ones we've seen were in the past. That's when some of this cyclical stuff started to get to me, though. It was like, okay, so I sort of have the sense that society is declining in various ways, but like, couldn't it not decline again? Like, what would that take? Can we like do anything? Do we just have to wait? No, like Tyler Cowen's a genius. Give him some money. My husband's writing a progress studies book. It's funded by Tyler Cowen stuff. So I'm like, maybe we shouldn't be criticizing that.
Maybe, I mean, this is all making me think of a point you made a while ago now about kind of neoliberal progress. And I tend to find a similar suspicion, I think, that I worry that funding existing, I'd absolutely like funding the effective altruism community and funding the people who want to think about this. My worry is whether there's stuff that we're not seeing, that really we are going with kind of one model of the future. And I worry basically that in some ways we are assuming that, you know, what needs to happen in the next 100 years is very similar to what happened maybe in the past 70 in kind of the post-war, that the same kind of progress we can keep kind of increasing. And this is also, I found myself reacting a little bit to Bostrom's idea that technological progress, right, is this continuity where as long as you keep investing, eventually you discover the same things. I actually do think that I hope once again that the future in a couple hundred years will have some of the same gaps as we do from the ancient past to, you know, ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient everywhere, that maybe it's not just the amount of technology we have, but our values in civil society look fundamentally different. And that's why my sense is that we should once again absolutely be funding these entrepreneurial ventures that you're saying. But I wonder if there's ways that we need to be even kind of, if there's a way to go beyond the diversification, whether we should be, yeah, I and this was actually something I was really curious to ask you, Mike, if there's anything that we should really be chasing that we might not have thought of yet, either because it's too big, because it doesn't fit into current knowledge models or research models. I'm especially thinking, right, about whether when I'm talking about societies, like whether there's some way in which our current technological method, which is kind of a specifically constructed scientific method that also has this whole relationship to the university, if there's other things that we're not considering, whether on Asian models, African models, or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, so like meta level, I am kind of like a federalist or anarcho-capitalist when it comes to this stuff. Like, I think there should be 1,000 people trying 1,000 things. And you know, so yeah, I mean, I couldn't even claim to have an idea of what, you know, the vast majority of those would be. I am very attracted to ideas around, you know, the idea that like technology, like the pace of technological advancement is like outpacing the pace of like the advancement of wisdom, call it, or sort of how to deal with that technology. And so very interested in like, you know, folks who have projects for, you know, catching up the wisdom side, which is, I don't know how you'd even talk about that. But I mean, I don't know. I would sort of say like macro, you know, I'm kind of an effective altruist, and then micro, I'm kind of a Buddhist, and I find those frameworks just very helpful for me. And so I don't know, maybe there's ways to, you know, bring sort of like wisdom traditions to more people who are grappling with like navigating the modern world. So that would be something that I would be super interested in putting more time and effort and resources behind. Actually, one thing I just wanted to ask Pamela, who's your husband and what's his book? I wanna track it so when it comes out, I can check it out.
Yeah, my husband's name is Bern Hobart. He writes a newsletter. Oh, yeah.
He's writing a book about, I don't know him personally. I Twitter know him.
Yeah, many such cases. I used to have more followers than him. I used to, not very long ago, be more Twitter famous than him.
Oh my God, you gotta, yeah, totally. I get it. Cool.
Do you guys know this? I'm not an expert at this. There's this concept of like leapfrogging progress-wise, which is like, so, you know, maybe in the West, people have been consuming more energy for a long time, but like in still developing or still industrializing, I don't know what the like correct term right now is, countries, they're in this weird position where like they sort of jumped over what seemed like they were going to be stages. So like many of them have mobile phones, but like not a toilet, you know, like it's weird. It's sort of like incongruous. And it sort of makes me wonder, like, I don't know if that sort of thing is like going to keep happening. You know, if some of these technologies start to come into being, like you can radically extend your life and, you know, treat diseases much more effectively, and you're aiming more at achieving like radical and durable happiness instead of just like dodging life's various miseries. You know, like that's a thing that would like arise like in a city, you know, like in a place. I'm imagining it would be the US, of course, but like it could, the US not do it, like it could be somewhere else, right? And so then what happens? Do you like send this, you like put it on a UPS plane and like send it to Africa, and they like leapfrog those pieces about sort of, you know, what dying is like and all the miseries involved with 150,000 people dying every single day. I think that this is actually interesting because it's an example of a type of progress that we've made that actually has contributed to a lot of suffering. Atul Gawande writes about this a lot, but it's like the trajectory of death used to be like you fall and hurt yourself and you die 3 days later of, you know, tetanus or something. And now the trajectory of death is often like a very slow, medically mediated decline with very little quality of life in it. And this made me wonder, is it possible that developing countries will like leapfrog the messy death stage? Like they go from like having very little medical care, and then we get radical life extension, and then they never have to go through like the bad deaths that all our grandparents had. Like, I don't know how to, I don't really have a point to this. I just think it's very, you know, we're thinking about it as like, oh, and then humans would get such and such. But that's not how these things like actually unfold. It's like in a time and a place with a certain speed, and the future is unevenly distributed and so on.
Yeah, I love those ideas. I mean, I think like a lot of people do look to, I don't know the correct phrase, but the developing world for those types of ideas. I mean, there's this whole like charter cities and governance futurism movement, and sometimes they look towards like less developed countries because they're like, oh, these are a little bit more like blank canvases or spaces that would be willing to be sort of more creative with the ways that they organize societies. Or like even just you see it in industries, right? Like radiology has always been an industry that adopts technology super quickly, but then ironically they fall behind because they get stuck with like the V1, you know, modality and can't like adopt new ones. And so they actually end up usually being behind, even though they're sort of early adopters. And so I don't know. I mean, I think there's sort of this like, there's like this danger of kind of like this neo-colonialist instinct where it's like, like let's go to these developing countries and like build all these things that couldn't exist in like our sclerotic Western worlds, or vice versa. Like, like let's develop great things here and then, you know, export them out to the people who really need them in these, you know, places with lower GDP per capita. And I don't know, like I don't have an answer, but I just think those are such interesting conversation starters.
Does anyone know that the answer to this, which is like, if you are a person who like wants to devote time and attention to getting better at predicting the future, like becoming a super forecaster, that sort of thing, like what do those people do? And is there any like known learning trajectory to approach this directly? Or is it just like there's random weirdos in the right time at the right place that someone listens to them and they like make a good forecast a couple times? Like, I don't know anything about this. Mm-hmm.
I can say like a sort of 2 minute, a 1 minute thing, which is just that, I mean, there's a bunch of people working on what is sometimes called kind of calibration training, where basically what you do is you just make dozens, actually more like hundreds or even thousands of predictions for kind of carefully defined questions, and you know, you make those in a kind of a way that is sort of clearly recorded, and then you let the clock play out and sort of see how you're doing. There's a few people who've like tried to develop kind of calibration training tools. There's this guy Danny Hernandez. We actually interviewed him on the 80,000 Hours podcast. I think he originally was kind of working on a bunch of the stuff at a startup called Twitch. You know, he was kind of interested in just improving decision making, you know, internally at that company. And you know, he was wondering if he could do anything about this. And yeah, you know, he was sort of building on top of obviously Philip Tetlock's kind of stuff. But yeah, he just kind of made an app which asks you a bunch of questions, and you know, it's actually a thing you can just do for like 10 or 30 minutes or something, and you get like quick feedback. And he claims that, you know, he was able to develop apps that, you know, did seem to have a sort of you know, a lasting positive influence on sort of giving people a sense of like what it feels like to actually be, you know, 80% confident versus 60% confident. Like it does seem like that's actually a sort of cognitive skill or like, you know, sense that, you know, one can cultivate. The other sort of thing to say is just that, you know, that there are a bunch of communities that are sort of, you know, have like sprouted up around these sorts of ideas. The one that most comes to mind is called Metaculus. That's METACULUS. And you know, there they have a website. You can sign up, and you know, you still have a profile, and you can make predictions over months and years about various like community questions. And they have, you know, there's actually a pretty rich and sort of deep art to asking, you know, questions that have clear and uncontroversial resolutions, and so on. But you know, they also have some training materials. I understand that, you know, Phil Tetlock, you know, the book Super Forecasting tells some stories about this, and I understand that, you know, U.S. intelligence agencies and so on had sort of also tried to develop programs to help improve the performance of their analysts. I've not read the book. I don't really have a great sense of like what's on there. But again, you know, 80,000 hours. We did a couple of podcast interviews with Phil Tetlock on these topics. So like, I think there is, you know, it feels like quite nascent to me, or at least, you know, my sort of outsider's impression is that somewhat nascent as a sort of thing where there's like a formal path for learning to become a super forecaster. But it is, there are people working on it. It is a serious thing. It's not obviously a massive scam, and it's certainly not this thing where, you know, there's just a few people being in the right place at the right time getting lucky. Like, we definitely know it's not that. You know, there's clearly a bunch of people who are actually achieving, you know, really quite unusually strong performance. Yeah, I feel like, oh yeah, one other thing to say is just that some random colleague of mine, you know, the weirdo comment is funny, that there's an incoming staff member at 8,000 Hours who you know, has been a school teacher for the last, like, I don't know, 5-10 years. And he just sort of randomly got excited about super forecasting, and you know, kind of was doing it as a hobby via some of these platforms, and you know, managed, like, personally achieved sort of really quite impressive improvement over the time that he was engaged with it. So, you know, I think there's some pretty interesting. This is like a really interesting space, and like I actually want to look at it a bunch more. Does anyone else have something to add on like the state of prediction training, calibration training, and such like?
I was just going to note that I did read the book, and he does kind of go through, here's like the principles to follow, here's the people who kind of became quite good. I found, though, that in terms of this conversation, right, it's basically agreed that the level of predictions that they're making and evaluating on are, for the purpose of this conversation, fairly short term. So, right, it's over a, you know, at most several year time horizon, which the book definitely convinced me is very important for people like CIA analysts who are trying to predict how things will go in the near future. I wasn't convinced, though, of, you know, do the same skills kind of apply to very long-term predictions. And it's hard, right? Because you can't really make the nice kind of data set of here's all these predictions and then here's what happened like 60 years later or something of broad trends in human culture. I imagine there are people working on this, but I'm very interested to see more of the discussions around the longer term stuff, though.
How relevant do you guys think this actually is for building a better future? I mean, I guess in terms of prioritizing some cause areas, but I mean, I don't think we have to be very precise in predicting, you know, the next pandemic to know that we should probably have good measures in place in case the next one's like really, really bad. So I'm just, I don't know if I'm entirely convinced that it's like super relevant to be to have a bunch of super forecasters to have a general operational, to have a general idea of like what it is we need to focus on to avoid catastrophe.
It seems like you'd want people in the major areas that are sources of existential threats. You know, like you say, you'd want someone who really understands pandemics, who can say, hey, maybe next time we should be prepared to do this. You know, someone who understands the development of nuclear weapons, nanotechnology, things like that. Yeah, I don't know if it's possible for anyone to be a super forecaster across all domains.
This is part of where I start to feel frustrated with the people like who I see online who are really long-termists or whatever. They try to make this rhetorical move, which is like, oh, you know, preventing the next pandemic / nuclear war / other existential thing goes here is so, you know, it's like worth so much that we should spend literally any amount of money now to prevent it, even if there's only like a 1 in 1,000 chance, you know, like, and that's all from like a certain way of thinking about expected value, you know, like the expected value of that outcome is so bad in these terms that it's like not, it doesn't make sense to not pay even very massive costs now. But it's all predicated on some of these issues that we've already been talking about here, which is, you know, how much discount should we make for things that are not only uncertain but in the distant future. Like sort of morally we might care about those people in various ways, whoever they will be, but obviously rearranging our lives in certain ways now to give massive amounts of money to like all sorts of existential things would represent quite a difference in our way of life that matters in some moral sense as well. And I think that I get the sense that those types of rhetorical moves don't win many people over, even if those individuals offering them find them quite compelling, right? Like those individuals sometimes literally saw something like that on a blog and then like got a different job. And I get it, like whatever their personality is, found that point of view extremely compelling. Like, oh my God, what am I doing optimizing the widgets? Like humanity is at risk, but many people do not react in that way, needless to say.
Sounds like some of those cases, I've seen a bunch of those as well, are probably the grifters you mentioned earlier. Yeah, there's no cause so good that you won't get grifters attached to it and trying to funnel money from other things.
Yeah, and that's why like, at least some other kinds of grifters, you sort of know what to say to them. You're like, oh, your apple cider vinegar thing, like doesn't, you know, there's no study for that or whatever. But with the things being in the future, especially with this being, you know, such a, like Peter says, nascent science, if it's the science at all, it's maybe harder to identify.
Definitely is. And then sometimes you feel like an ass for saying, wait, that's not that big a deal. And it's like, it may be that big a deal potentially, but it's one of several possible threats. So yeah, it is, it's kind of a Wild West landscape as far as attempts to understand and quantify the risk.
Yeah, and when stuff is Wild West like that, I mean, just sort of like the generalities of movements or human social groups or non-governmental organizations or whatever, it sort of suggests that like, okay, first there are like a few weirdos who really do like know something and care, and they're really into it in like a completely good-hearted way, and they raise things that other people didn't know, whatever. But like as they get louder and more influential, like stuff gets weird. You know, it's not just grifters, but you get like hysteric piler honors who have ulterior motives. And then you get Baptist and bootlegger dynamics of various kinds. And like, it becomes even harder to see what's going on than it already was, which is to say very hard.
There's almost a law of entropy there. Like you're always going to have a certain number of grifters, you know, hysterics, people who kind of turn it into a new religion and start following it. I wonder if there's a level of that we can tolerate and still make forward progress, because we have seen progress be made. There've been I remember when they got rid, when they decreased aerosols in spray cans, and that actually helped the hole over the ozone layer. That was a victory. And there are all sorts of alarmists and grifters and things like that involved with that too. So I wonder if we might just have to carve out some space and say, this is a great idea. It's going to attract some grifters. It's going to attract some people who take it too far, but let's see if we can keep it moving forward.
How much of these long-termist proposals actually require like incredibly massive changes? Like, I don't know, for pandemic stuff, I imagine you want to have like some stopgaps in place, like, or for nuclear stuff, maybe you want to have more people in the loop required to launch a nuke. Like, what else? Asteroid protection, maybe that would be like a big NASA contract, but like in the grand scheme of things, probably a drop in the bucket. I mean, I'm asking, like, do you guys know if any of these existential risk proposals are incredibly like life altering and like in practice?
To Pamela's point, I'm sure for each one, there's someone who would tell us they were life altering.
I think I see this raised. I mean, I do not have normal social circles online or offline, but I see these types of points sometimes raised in the context of like an unfriendly AI that poses an existential risk to the human species. And that's when we're like, I don't not get it. I like, if you came to me individually and were like, how many dollars will you put into this hat to prevent this? Like, it would not be $0, but it would not be appreciable in comparison to like my annual income, I don't think. But like literally there are people I know who are like kept up at night over that sort of thing.
But
I'm not sure how high your annual income is, Pamela, but are you suggesting that, sorry, I just want to make sure I understood the suggestion. We saying like, hundreds of thousands of dollars to AI safety seems off to you, or indeed, like what we're currently at is what, like kind of tens of millions, maybe hundreds, depending on how you define it. It's probably more like
yeah,
like
I guess
that like hundreds of thousands seems like, yeah.
I don't have well-honed intuitions or opinions on this, but what I was trying to offer in response to Christian's point is he seemed to be saying the very sensible thing, which is like, how much could it really cost? Like, you do a little more careful pandemic stuff, you do a little more careful nuke stuff, you like put some food in some silos or whatever. Like, we could actually do this. We could actually do like much more long-term risk mitigation than we already are, like without anyone living in a shack and giving all their money to the pandemic thing, which I'm sure is true to some extent, but it is a Pascal's type of thing, which is like, once you introduce something that is completely risky and even possible, it starts to swamp the ideological landscape. And then some of those people are activists in this messy economy of activism, and they want money, So some people have this playful experimental spirit, like Mike Howard, just like, give some people some money, like see what they do, And then these other people are like, we really have to do absolutely everything we can now to prevent this extremely remote but extremely dangerous thing. And probably
what you're saying that, it slightly reminds me of the dynamic around COVID right now. Where, in a sense, there's a Pascal's wager there, where it's like, well, there's a small chance, everyone's like feeling very aware of this like very salient risk of a particular way of dying, and wanting to eradicate, get the risk down to 0%, rather than, or as close to that as possible, which at a certain point becomes ridiculous.
And that's an even better analogy than it maybe at first seems, which is that, people have latched on now to this public messaging about the variants, and they've latched onto it. And so some of them are like, no, I don't care that you're completely low risk and you're vaccinated and the dinner is outside. If there's any chance that your infection would contribute to a variant that was at all worse than COVID, then it's like wrong and irresponsible for you to do that thing. And so they're not wrong that that does contribute in a small way to the likelihood of another even worse variant arising, but it's that runaway train type of logic.
It's kind of a really sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know how much in practice is going to matter. Like the AI safety, STEM lords can raise a hissy fit all they want, but like Congress isn't going to give them $20 billion. It's just not going to happen. Like in practice, I just think the stopgap of like practicality is going to, cut that cord really quickly. They might raise some funding, and that's honestly probably a good thing. Like I was, Peter, because of your website, I almost went into AI safety because I was so convinced of it. That I didn't, because I'm not a utilitarian anymore, but like I was pretty convinced for a while. But at the end of the day, there are reasons not to be throwing your hands up like and screaming the sky is falling everywhere you go. But again, some money thrown in that direction would be good. And practically speaking, what's going to realistically happen is they'll get some money, and they do have some money. And we have Mila, there's OpenAI thinks about this kind of stuff, DeepMind. I mean, those organizations exist. Like there is money there, and one of them is backed by Google. So like it's definitely happening. So the fear of, hey, they're gonna all these guys are gonna finagle their way into billions of dollars, I just don't think is really something we're gonna have to lose sleep over. It's gonna be annoying. I roll my eyes at it, but what are you gonna do? I don't think they're gonna suck up that much of the resources ultimately.
I tend to always be in support of just fund everything, like fund those, but also fund the other things. I think the AI example is specific because I think I have a similar slight skepticism towards the AI safety. And my particular worry there is that the way I see the discourse, which non-expert, this is not my job, so I'm probably just missing things, but I see people very focused on X-risk versions of AI, which I find to be interesting from an intellectual perspective, but not very convincing of this is relatively likely to happen. And then relatively little focus on what I see to be much more likely consequences of AI technology. And right, you do often have there's a big gap between the people who are worried about X risk and people who are worried about, bias in civil institutions, obviously. And OpenAI specifically, I find that there's a lot of funding, for the people who are saying there's an S-risk for AI, therefore we need to be the first people to invent general artificial intelligence, which I don't actually find very convincing, even from a utilitarian perspective of if we're this worried about AI, should we be having our current imperfect understanding, imperfect institutions be charging to discover this because we trust that they're going to do, the right things. They're going to be the ones to really understand it. There's a little bit of the famous example that I think actually Bostrom brings up, of the case in the atomic bomb where they were trying to figure out, we need to do this to defeat the Nazis, but will this ignite the atmosphere instead and just kill all of humanity and all of life on Earth? And I think it's really important to calculate those relative risks, because when we're talking about such abstract situations and potential futures, I think it's much less clear, and there's a real danger in having one prevailing opinion on this.
Dave, you were going to say something earlier.
Yeah, I was thinking in a way that, the panic and the hysteria might ultimately lead to solutions. Because at some point, someone has to decide where to put the money. And a lot of times, that winds up being the government because they're the biggest concentration of money that will be put to preventative things rather than something that could turn a profit. And what's the government going to fund? The thing that people are the most scared of. So as annoying as some of the AI alarmism or other sorts of alarmism can be, it all kind of comes out in the wash. They do sort of serve a purpose because that eventually directs resources to those things. And again, it's hardly efficient, but things get done. It seems like there should be a better way, but I can't think what that better way would be. At some point, there's got to be resources. Someone has to be in charge of those resources. So who makes the call? Government's not perfect, but at least it's large and difficult to control.
But the thing is, when is that some point? That's the worry. And until we reach that some point, who are the people going to get hurt? When the AI is used in a way that is not, we say, that is the advancement of humanity. So when do we reach that some point where this funding and things goes to the right people for right things? But so between now and that some point, what are the bad things? How it's going to be used in a bad way that's going to affect people, and who are those people?
Yeah, I'll just say a few quick things in response to a couple of the things that came up. I mean, firstly, this worry about, I think Pamela sort of first raised this worry about kind of throwing a ton of resources in the sort of direction of these ideas, creating all sorts of like dysfunctional dynamics. Yeah, it's just a massive worry, and there's a lot of people kind of, within the effective altruism community, agonizing over this, like trying to figure out how to, what the best forms of mitigation one could come up with are, and there's already some trouble in this regard, but luckily we're still relatively early, and there's actually been a kind of explicit decision. I think early on in sort of the history of effective altruism, there was this idea that kind of naive idea maybe that sort of we should really aim to become like a kind of mainstream, extremely sort of well-known thing that kind of everyone is talking about over breakfast as quickly as possible. But I think in the last like at least 5 years, maybe a bit longer, yeah, probably a bit longer at this point, there was a kind of a sort of slamming on the brakes kind of moment where people were like, oh wait, this could easily go like horribly wrong, and we should go much slower and focus much more on sort of quality over quantity in terms of like movement growth, and concretely that just means kind of, although we might be, maybe it's useful to sort of blast out particular messages into sort of a fairly sort of wide sphere. We're sort of not like, we're sort of kind of focused on really like trying to figure out what is like valuable about this sort of nascent sort of body of ideas and sort of nascent community, and then really trying to kind of double down on that, and have like a very solid core that is good before we end up with like too many resources in terms of like money and people and so on, and getting a ton of attention. It's not, of course, it's not like there's sort of some central planning committee that's figuring all this stuff out. It's sort of pretty, it's kind of chaotic and kind of random in all the ways one would expect, but there is at least some thought, and certainly there's like some careful thought and a fair bit of agonizing over like and worries about these sorts of dynamics. And I just think they're just obviously a big issue. Then the second point, but I kind of sympathize with the idea that in a sense, like you can hope for this kind of stuff to come out in the wash. Like we have to sort of work with what we have, and funding mechanisms and sort of resource allocation mechanisms that actually exist. And yeah, like you sort of hope that there'll be a degree of, I don't know, it's kind of easier when you're getting started, because when you're getting started, like you just have nothing. And so it's kind of clear that like putting a bit of like society, putting a bit of a bet on this like group is worth it. but we may well be at approaching or even already at the point where it's kind of starting to become a bit more questionable, like just how many of like the brightest young people should be going into these things. And yeah, I don't know, there is, yeah, and just how much we can like punt on this question by just saying, well, we know we're orders of magnitude too short. So like surely a little going up a couple is like worth it. But yeah, I think, I actually forgot the other point I wanted to respond to that somebody made, but I guess there's also this kind of question about like how scalable some of these sort of memes and ideas are. One of the things I like about progress studies as a community and a sort of set of ideas is that it seems to me that they thought really from the outset very deeply about how to make a kind of scalable set of norms in a way that I'm not sure that the effective altruism community did, or like founders did, because the idea of sort of focus on neglectedness, which is obviously like a central thing in EA, like that doesn't scale. At a certain point, like if everyone's listening to you, like that becomes unstable. It kind of works when you sort of know you're only influencing like a tiny fraction of like talent on the margin. Cheers, Dave. But yeah, it seems to me like the progress studies, the sort of maximize the rate of sustainable economic growth, that's a highly scalable maxim. That's a maxim that a society could pick up. And that's a virtue of that whole framework. And I'm a bit less sure about what a kind of scaled up version of the sort of long-termist effective altruism stuff would look like. There are a couple of people thinking about a kind of long-termist virtue ethics. So like what kinds of what kinds of things would like a sort of virtuous long-termist community kind of embody?
Wait, do you have resources for that? I'm like super interested in that.
Yes, I think there's a couple of EA forum posts. Let me see. EA forum. I'll
you can do it after the fact. That's fine.
Yeah, I'll post some stuff in the follow-up. I don't have like the single title of the thing, but the fellow who's been thinking about it is a guy called Owen Cotton Barrett. Is the one who I most think of talking about these things. But yeah, I mean, I think there's like a rich, and valuable and important bunch of thinking to be done there. But yeah, I'm like super scared about this whole thing about like how do you have a functional community when like the feedback mechanisms are just like literally impossible to put in place.
You think there's just something about scaling communities in general? It seems like you just break down once they hit a critical mass,
Yeah, it's just always a brutally hard problem, right? And then it's like even worse if the thing you ultimately care about is a long way off. The closest thing, the best thing you can do is just have like come up with some kind of lead metrics or sort of proxies that you think are like reasonably reliable yardsticks for sort of measuring progress towards the thing you actually care about. And I think there are some ideas floating around about what those might be, and developing and improving on that. It would be like a really valuable intellectual project. So I don't know, Pamela. Basically, I just really buy this worry, but I guess I'm also I'm not seeing it as kind of I'm seeing it as like a serious concern. Yeah, I don't know, not a fatal one, at least at this point. I guess I actually would be kind of interested to hear you say a bit more. Like early on in the conversation, you sort of pointed at a thought. You said something like, I worry if like basically just a tiny fraction of people should sort of be thinking in these kind of terms, and really like for most of the rest, it should just not be top of mind at all. I was wondering, could you say a bit more about sort of the handful of sort of key reasons that you sort of you have that view?
Yeah, I mean, big disclaimer that like I do not wish to be held to this, and I have not thought about this seriously, which is part of why I'm here, etc. Like the people I know are not randomly selected. However, by and large, it seems like most of them, to the extent that the people I know have done any thinking about long-term stuff at all, it has been deeply harmful to them rather than edifying, in that it mostly creates a lot of anxiety about things over which they have no direct control, about things that may or may not ever come to pass. And it happens within people's individual psychic economy that is time and energy limited, which is to say all the time you spend biting your nails and creating an ulcer over climate change because you drive a car and like you shouldn't have kids and stuff. Like it really, more and more it's obvious that these things, people are not just performing, like they actually are quite worried and feel very bad and are making different choices in their lives, and like it's keeping them up at night, so to speak. They're not people who are like learning skills at forecasting. They're not people who have any ability to do anything other than make different consumer purchases, which is sort of like a faux solution, right? Like, oh, buy this carrot instead of that one, and we'll equalize your carbon emissions, whatever, right? Like, it's all like marketing stuff. So I understand that there's some reason to want there to be some people who can get better at predicting even the fairly long-term future so that we can make choices based on that in line with values, whatever those turn out to be. Like that is all fine. But it doesn't seem to me like there's a good way to participate in this on like a smaller individual level. And that when people try, it's like not good for them as individuals. I don't know how you get an ecosystem where there are like a handful of morally upright experts who get better and better at prediction and who have the ear of the government, and everyone else is just kind of like, those guys and girls have got this. We're going to worry about like today and the next 10 or 50 years. I don't know how you, like, I have no, I don't even know if that makes sense, like sort of as a thing to want, but if I could want something, like that's what I would want. Whoever these people are who could actually get better at the actual science of prediction should, some non-zero but non-overwhelming amount of money should be put behind whatever that stuff is. And everyone else should just like get as small as possible with their life, because that's where sort of the felt meaning tends to come from, like small, small, small. There are people who have been brainwashed by our culture to think that things they do, like caring for their children or keeping their house a little tidy or like working at a job at a regular company, are empty. People have somehow learned that those things are like devoid of meaning. And that's part of what I try to help undo on a one-by-one level. And when they reach for like that legible meaning, a lot of times it is the big stuff. Like they want to be involved in something like very big, but then all that stuff is anxiety ridden and they don't actually have any control over it and all those problems.
Well, I actually completely agree with you. I see this a lot in my life too, with people absolutely consumed by politics and different narratives in the media. And they, and honestly, I don't mean to offend anyone here, but I honestly think a lot of it is utilitarian thinking that is seeped into people's lives, is that they think it is all for the sake of the collective. Absolutely. It's an absolutist morality. It is the individual means nothing. It's all about, worshiping and sacrificing at the altar of global utility. They wouldn't be put in those terms, of course, but that's the underlying concept. So I actually just want to emphasize, I completely agree with that. I think a lot of the neurosis people of our times in the very, I guess, online, very connected, very, educated, probably upper middle class world, the neurosis they suffer from comes from this kind of agent neutral thinking that like your individual small circle doesn't matter. In fact, it's a drop in the bucket, and that what you really should care about is the big total picture, which is nonsense. I think it's part of living a fulfilled, well-rounded, holistic life means caring about the collective, but it's not all for the collective. Ultimately, any kind of moral prescription has to be rooted in the values you actually do have. And factually, we just don't care about everyone the same. We don't, and there's nothing you could say to us that would change our minds, because that would that would be that would require appealing to our already existing values. And the value of caring about like your small circle, and then to a lesser extent the global tribe, I guess, is so deeply ingrained in our biology that if you're trying to change that, and people trying to change our empathy levels to care about everyone the same equally in like a very utilitarian way, it's a lost cause. You don't want to fight against biology that's that deeply rooted, nor is it honestly very desirable, in my opinion. I think life is going to be far more enjoyable on the individual level, and it would be better for everyone if we focused on doing what we can in our communities, with our families, with our friends, with our loved ones, and of course with an eye towards the collective. But that's one piece of the puzzle. It's not everything for that collective.
So I'm aware of time. I'm sort of like feeling pretty terrible to sort of try and cut things off, but I guess if anyone wants to sort of share a sort of closing reflection for sort of a few minutes, I'm happy that we could try and wrap in the next sort of couple. For what it's worth, like this won't be like fully over. I guess I'm hoping to host some more salons, and we can continue the discussion offline or off the call in the next days. But I'm aware of time. I know at least one of us has children here. Not me, thankfully. But yeah, would anyone like to share a sort of closing thought or reflection?
I think just thanks everyone for the great discussion, going a lot of different places.
Yeah, thanks for starting this conversation. Happy to be here, and a lot of thoughts, a lot of things to think about. And I think I'm also kind of interested in the question initially Pamela raised, and then I kind of expanded upon shortly now. I mean, I kind of feel actually. I also don't know, who's the group of people, whether it's okay to the group of people to do that. But I think it can, in a small way, kind of start with, us who are people kind of interested in spending time on this to kind of think about it, and kind of probably explore that. So it's good to be with you all and speak about this, and learn more about this, about the topic. And yeah, so yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for that.
Well, I've enjoyed this greatly, so thank you, everybody. I'll be surely thinking about this stuff over the next days, weeks, and months. So if any of you want to follow up in some way, please just get in touch. I'll definitely post a few things to the Intellect Discord if you guys are on that in the next days. This whole thing was recorded, so I'll at least share the recording with the attendees, and we'll have to kind of decide whether we think it's worth putting on YouTube or something in the next days. If you have any feelings about that, or if you want your contributions, some or all of them, to be edited out, just get in touch. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Does anyone else want to say something? Or Pamela's shaking her head. Christian had quite a good, yeah, but go for it.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to echo what everyone else said. I'm just so grateful that I get to have these conversations. When I saw there was an Intellect on with Henry Sidgwick in the title, like I lost it. I was like, what? I didn't know anyone else was reading him. I thought that was just like a half a dozen philosophy professors, and that was it. So Peter, very grateful for you hosting this, and I'm grateful to all of you guys for sharing your thoughts. I'm definitely going to be metabolizing that over the next few weeks for sure. So thank you.
Nice, thanks, Christian. Well, with that, I wish you good night.